He pressed the syringe down like it was nothing, just another Tuesday in the trauma bay. Then he looked up, and he smiled. The quiet nurse standing 6 feet away, the one nobody bothered to learn the name of, the one they spoke over and walked past and treated like she came with the furniture, she was the only person in that room who recognized what had just entered the Admiral's bloodstream. Not because she'd read about it, because she'd watched it kill 11 people she loved, and every single one of them had been under her care when they died. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just went still. The kind of still that only people who've survived something terrible ever learn. That stillness was about to burn this hospital to the ground. If this story satisfies something in you, if you've ever been ignored by someone who should have listened, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The fluorescent lights in Ridgemont Memorial Hospital had that specific institutional flicker. Not enough to notice if you were busy, but enough to give you a headache by hour 9. Mara Sinclair noticed. She always noticed things nobody else did. That was the problem. She'd been on shift since 5 a.m., 14 hours ago. Her scrubs had a coffee stain on the left thigh from when Dr. Brennan had bumped into her at the nurse's station without looking up from his phone, without apologizing, without even registering that a human body had been in his path. The coffee had been hers. The apology had also been hers. That was how things worked at Ridgemont. Mara was 31. Brown hair she kept in a low bun that was always slightly coming undone. No makeup. Pale skin that flushed pink when she was angry, which was more often than people realized, because Mara Sinclair had perfected the art of swallowing her anger whole and washing it down with hospital-grade coffee. She'd been at Ridgemont for 14 months. In that time, she'd caught 2 medication errors, flagged a mislabeled blood type that would have killed a teenager, and correctly identified early-stage sepsis in a patient that 3 residents had written off as anxious. No one had thanked her. Dr. Ellison, the chief of medicine, had actually pulled her aside after the sepsis call and told her to stay in her lane. "You're a floor nurse, Mara, not a diagnostician." She'd nodded. Gone home. Sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, not moving. That was 4 months ago. Tonight, the emergency department was drowning. A multi-vehicle pileup on the I-94 had sent 9 patients through the doors in under an hour, and the trauma bays were overflowing. Mara had been pulled from her floor to assist, something that happened often enough to be routine. She didn't complain. She never complained. She was restocking an IV cart in Trauma Bay 3 when the call came over the intercom. Code Blue, Trauma 1. All available hands. Mara moved. Not fast, not slow. The kind of purposeful walk that comes from years of responding to emergencies. She pushed through the double doors into Trauma Bay 1 and found controlled chaos. 6 people surrounded the gurney. The patient was male, late 60s, built like a man who'd once been powerful and was now fighting time. His face was gray, an oxygen mask covered his mouth. Cardiac monitors screamed in overlapping alarms. "Who is this?" someone asked. "VIP," the charge nurse said, and that was all anyone needed to hear. The energy in the room changed. Backs straightened, voices dropped. A VIP meant attention, which meant accountability, which meant nobody could afford a mistake. Dr. Julian Wolfe walked in 30 seconds later, and the room adjusted around him like a solar system finding its center. Wolfe was the chief of surgery at Ridgemont Memorial. Tall, precise, expensive haircut. He wore his authority the way some men wear cologne. You smelled it before you saw him. He was respected in the way that powerful people in institutions are respected, not because everyone liked him, but because everyone understood what happened to people who crossed him. "Talk to me," Wolfe said. Dr. Patel, the attending on duty, rattled off the numbers. Male, 68, presented with acute chest pain and dyspnea. BP crashing, 90/50 and falling. History of a triple bypass 4 years ago. Suspected MI. Name? Rear Admiral Lawrence Beckett, retired Navy. His detail called it in. Mara was at the edge of the room, preparing a tray of supplies. She heard the name and her hands paused for a fraction of a second, so brief that no one noticed. Her face didn't change. She kept working. Wolfe snapped on gloves. "Get me a central line kit. Push another round of epi, and clear this room. I don't need spectators." 2 residents backed out. A medical student followed. Mara stayed because she was restocking, and because nobody ever noticed if she stayed or left. She watched Wolf work. He was good. She'd give him that. His hands were fast and certain, and he moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from thousands of procedures. He established the central line in under 2 minutes, called for imaging, adjusted the ventilator settings. Then he reached for something on the secondary tray. It was a small vial. Unlabeled. Mara's eyes tracked the vial from the tray to Wolf's hand to the syringe he drew it into. She watched him check the volume. Not against a chart, not against an order. He just drew it, like he already knew exactly how much he needed. Her throat tightened. She'd seen this before. Not here. Not in any hospital. In a place she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. A forward operating base in a country she'd signed documents promising never to name. She'd watched a substance in an unlabeled vial enter an IV line and stop a heart in under 90 seconds. She'd watched it happen to a 24-year-old sergeant named Danny Flores who'd been laughing about a letter from his daughter 10 minutes earlier. She knew what it looked like. She knew what it did. She knew the color, faintly amber, almost clear, easy to miss if you weren't looking. And she was looking. Wolf pushed the syringe into the Admiral's IV port, smooth, unhurried, like he'd done it 100 times. Then he looked up, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something worse. Something satisfied. That IV is wrong. IV. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. The room froze. 5 heads turned toward her. Mara stood holding a roll of surgical tape, and she felt every eye land on her like a physical weight. Her face was already going pink. Her voice hadn't been loud. If anything, it had been too quiet, the way she always was. But in the silence of a trauma bay, quiet carries. "Excuse me?" Wolf said. She should have backed down. Every survival instinct she'd built in 14 months at this hospital told her to apologize, look at the floor, and disappear. But her eyes were on the syringe, on the port, on the monitor, where the Admiral's already fragile rhythm was beginning to stutter in a way that didn't match any standard medication response. "The injection you just administered," she said. "It's not on the chart. That compound, it's not standard protocol for cardiac stabilization. Silence. The kind that hums." Dr. Patel looked at the chart, then at Wolf. Wolf didn't look at the chart. He looked at Mara. "Who are you?" "Mara Sinclair, floor nurse, 4th. I didn't ask for your resume. I asked who you think you are, questioning a procedure in my trauma bay." "The IV is exactly what this patient needs, which I determined based on 30 years of surgical experience. How many years do you have, Nurse Sinclair?" She said nothing. "That's what I thought." He turned to the charge nurse. "Get her out of here, now." The charge nurse, a woman named Val who had never once made eye contact with Mara in 14 months, stepped forward with the efficiency of someone happy to follow orders. "Come on, Mara, let's go." "Something is wrong with that injection," Mara said, louder now. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the effort of keeping her voice level when everything in her body was screaming. "Check it. Just check what's in the syringe. Run it through the analyzer. 30 seconds. "Security to Trauma 1, Wolf said into the room phone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Dr. Wolf, I'm telling you, and I'm telling you that if you don't leave this room in the next 5 seconds, you will never work in a hospital in this state again." He turned back to the patient. "Someone get her chart access revoked before she leaves the building." 2 security guards arrived. They were young, thick-necked, uncomfortable. One of them recognized Mara from the cafeteria, where she'd once helped him figure out how to use the new vending machine. He wouldn't meet her eyes now. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." He injected something off protocol into a dying man. "Someone needs to—" "Ma'am?" They didn't grab her. They didn't have to. They flanked her and walked, and she either moved with them or became the kind of scene that would follow her to every job interview for the rest of her career. She moved. The walk from Trauma Bay 1 to the administrative wing took 4 minutes, long enough for word to spread. Mara saw it happening in real time. The sidelong glances from the nurse's station, the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed, the way people she'd worked beside for over a year suddenly became fascinated by their computer screens. Carol Ashworth, the hospital director, was waiting in her office despite it being nearly midnight. She was a small woman with a sharp gray bob, and the kind of face that had been frozen into professional pleasantness for so long it no longer looked natural. "Sit down, Mara." "Miss Ashworth, I need to report." "Sit down." Mara sat. "Dr. Wolf has filed a formal complaint. You disrupted a critical procedure on a VIP patient, refused to follow direct orders, and created a hostile environment in the trauma bay. Combined with your previous incidents of overstepping clinical boundaries." "Previous incidents? You mean the times I caught mistakes that could have killed? Your employment at Ridgemont Memorial is terminated, effective immediately." Ashworth slid a document across the desk. "Sign this. It includes a standard non-disparagement clause. You'll receive 2 weeks severance." Mara stared at the paper. The words blurred. Not because she was crying, she wasn't, but because something behind her eyes was restructuring, recalibrating, adjusting to a new reality with the mechanical precision of someone who had been through worse. She'd been through worse. "If he killed that man," Mara said quietly, "this document won't protect you. Sign it or leave without severance. Those are your options." Mara stood up. She didn't sign. She walked out of the office, down the hall, past the security desk, through the automatic doors, and into the parking lot. The night air hit her face. October in Minneapolis. Cold enough to sting. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed, and for a moment she was somewhere else entirely, standing outside a field hospital in a desert with sand in her teeth, and blood on her boots, and the sound of a helicopter that had come too late. She closed her eyes. Opened them. She pulled out her phone. No messages. No one from inside had texted to check on her. 14 months of showing up early, staying late, covering shifts, catching errors, and not a single person had sent a text. She started walking toward the parking garage. She made it 40 steps before she heard the engines. The sound came from the east, low, heavy, multiplied. Not ambulances, not police, something bigger. Mara stopped and turned. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans rolled into the hospital's main entrance like a slow-moving wall. They didn't use the emergency lane. They drove straight up the center approach and stopped in a formation that blocked all 3 exits. Behind them, 2 unmarked sedans pulled in at angles, and men in dark suits stepped out with the coordinated precision of people who had rehearsed this arrival. Mara watched from the sidewalk. Her mind cataloged details automatically, a habit she'd never been able to break. Federal plates, comm earpieces, sidearms visible under jackets but not drawn, at least 12 agents. This wasn't a response to a 911 call. This was a planned operation. A woman stepped out of the lead Suburban. Late 40s, black, built like someone who ran 5 miles before most people's alarms went off. She wore a dark pantsuit and no jewelry. Her badge was already in her hand. She walked directly toward Mara, not toward the hospital, not toward the emergency department, toward a fired nurse standing alone on a sidewalk with a coffee stain on her scrubs. "Mara Sinclair," the woman said. Not a question. Mara didn't respond. "My name is Special Agent Diane Okafor, Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division." She held the badge at eye level, long enough for Mara to read it. "We need to talk. I've just been fired. Whatever this isn't about the hospital, and you weren't fired because you made a mistake." Okafor's voice dropped half a register. "You were fired because you were right." Mara stared at her. "The man on that table, Admiral Beckett, is scheduled to testify before a closed Senate committee in 72 hours. His testimony involves a classified operation that took place 4 years ago in a region I'm not going to name on this sidewalk. Dr. Julian Wolf was placed at this hospital 3 years ago, specifically to ensure that testimony never happens." The parking lot lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere behind them, an ambulance siren wailed and faded. "You know what Wolf injected," Okafor said. "Don't you?" Mara's jaw tightened. "Tetrodoxyphenol compound. Military-grade cardiotoxin. Undetectable in standard tox screens. Mimics acute cardiac failure." She said it the way someone recites their own address. Flat, automatic, from a place deeper than memory. Okafor nodded slowly. "You've seen it before." "Yes." "Firebase Kestrel. 4 years ago. Operation Black Ridge." Mara's hands curled into fists at her sides, her nails dug into her palms. 11 members of your medical support unit were killed in what was officially classified as an enemy mortar attack, Okafor continued. The investigation was closed in 72 hours. Bodies were repatriated under sealed protocol. No media, no congressional review, nothing. They weren't killed by mortars, Mara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. There was no attack. We were poisoned. We know. We've known for 2 years. The words hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back. You've known for 2 years, she repeated, and this time her voice had an edge that could cut glass. 2 years. And you let me. You let me think I was crazy. You let me think I imagined it. The VA therapist told me I had survivor's guilt. My own family stopped calling because they thought I was... I understand your anger. You don't understand anything. You're right. I don't. Okafor held her gaze. But I'm here now, and that man in there is dying because of the same compound that killed your unit. The same person arranged both. Mara went still. That stillness again. The one that looked like calm but wasn't. Wolf, she said. Dr. Julian Wolf was not always a surgeon. Before his medical career, he spent 6 years as a defense contractor specializing in chemical research for Valcorp Industries. He was embedded with military operations in 3 theaters. He had access to experimental compounds, classified supply chains, and the operational details of every forward medical unit in the region, including yours. He sold us out. He sold your unit's location, schedule, and medical supply manifest to a hostile arms network in exchange for $3.2 million wired to an offshore account in Cyprus. The attack was staged to cover the poisoning. Your unit was killed because they had unknowingly treated casualties from an unauthorized weapons test, and they could identify the chemical signatures. Mara's vision narrowed. The parking lot, the agents, the hospital behind her, it all compressed into a single point. A single face. Julian Wolf, standing over the Admiral's bed. That almost smile. That satisfied twitch at the corner of his mouth. He'd killed her friends. He'd killed Danny Flores and Sergeant Keiko Watanabe and Corporal Marcus Ridley and 9 others whose faces she saw every night when she closed her eyes. He'd killed them, and then he'd walked into a civilian hospital and built a career saving lives, and no one had ever looked twice. And tonight, he was doing it again. The Admiral, Mara said. Is he still alive? Okafor touched her earpiece, listened. For now. The compound works in stages. If it follows the same timeline as Black Ridge, he has approximately 40 minutes before irreversible cardiac failure. Your people can't just walk in there and... Dr. Wolf has support inside the hospital. We don't know how deep it goes yet. If we move too fast, we risk... Okafor stopped, reconsidered. What I'm about to say is not an order. You are a civilian. You have every right to walk away. Say it. The antidote protocol for tetrodoxyphenol was developed at a military research facility that no longer exists. There are no civilian records, no published papers. The only people who knew the counteragent protocol were the combat medics assigned to units handling the compound. All of whom are dead, Mara said. Except me. Except you. The October wind pulled at Mara's loose hair. She looked at the hospital, at the building that had swallowed 14 months of her life and spit her out like something it couldn't digest. He'll see me coming, she said. Probably. And if he has people inside, we'll be behind you, but the medical response has to come first. If Beckett dies before we secure the evidence chain, Wolf walks. The entire network walks. Mara thought about Danny Flores. 24 years old, a daughter named Sophie, who would be 7 now. A letter with a crayon drawing of a house with too many windows. She'd been holding that letter when she found him dead. She thought about the 11 names she whispered to herself every night before sleep, like a prayer to nothing, like a roll call that no one would ever answer. She thought about the fact that she hadn't imagined any of it. I need a clean IV kit, 30 cubic centimeters of sodium bicarbonate, a vial of atropine, potassium chloride at half concentration, and access to a centrifuge, she said. And I need someone to get me back into that building without Wolf knowing until I'm in the room. Okafor allowed herself the faintest trace of a smile. Not warmth, recognition. Agent Reeves, she called to a man by the second SUV. Get Nurse Sinclair whatever she needs, and find me the service entrance blueprints for this building. Now. Mara pulled her hair back tight and refastened the bun. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Inside Ridgemont Memorial, a man she'd never met was dying from the same poison that had taken everything from her. And the man who'd arranged it all was standing over the body, wearing a white coat and a reputation, waiting for the monitors to flatline so he could shake his head sadly and say there was nothing more he could do. Not tonight. She started walking toward the building, and the agents fell in behind her. A quiet nurse with a coffee stain on her scrubs, flanked by a federal strike team, moving through the cold Minneapolis night toward a hospital that had thrown her away 2 hours ago. The automatic doors at the service entrance slid open. The hallway was empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in that same institutional flicker. Mara Sinclair stepped inside, and somewhere deep in the building, a cardiac monitor began to scream. The cardiac monitor's scream chased her through the service corridor like something alive. Mara counted the seconds between alarm tones, a habit from Kestrel, where the difference between a recoverable rhythm and a terminal one lived in the space of a single beep. The pattern she heard now was wrong, too fast, too erratic. Tetrodoxyphenol didn't kill clean, it strangled the heart in waves, each one tighter than the last, and the monitor was singing the song of a man entering the second wave. She had maybe 25 minutes, maybe less. Agent Reeves walked 2 steps behind her, a hard-sided medical case in his left hand. He was young, late 20s, crew cut, the kind of jaw that looked carved from regulation. He hadn't said a word since handing her the case outside, and she appreciated that more than he'd ever know. "Service elevator is 40 meters ahead, left turn past the mechanical room," Okafor's voice said through the earpiece they'd fitted her with. "Takes you to the second floor. Trauma 1 is East Wing, end of the main corridor." "I know where it is," Mara said. "I worked here for 14 months. "Copy." The service elevator smelled like industrial cleaner and old grease. Mara hit the button for the second floor and opened the medical case on the elevator floor. Her hands moved fast. Not graceful, not pretty, just fast. She uncapped the sodium bicarbonate, drew 30 cubic centimeters into a syringe, and prepped the atropine alongside it. The potassium chloride she measured twice, because getting it wrong would kill the Admiral faster than the poison. "The counteragent isn't a single drug," she said more to herself than to Reeves. "It's a sequence. Bicarb first to shift his blood pH and slow absorption, then atropine to stabilize the sinoatrial node. The potassium comes last, half concentration, titrated over 4 minutes. Too fast and his heart locks. Too slow, and the compound reaches the myocardial wall before I can pull it back." Reeves looked at her. "You've done this before?" "Once?" She didn't elaborate. Reeves didn't ask. The elevator doors opened. Second floor. The hallway lights were dimmer here, some kind of energy-saving protocol that kicked in after midnight. Mara stepped out and turned east. She could hear the chaos from 40 feet away. Voices overlapping. The crash cart's defibrillator charging with that high-pitched whine. Someone shouting for another round of epinephrine. The standard response, the one that wouldn't work, the one that would actually accelerate the compound's effect because nobody in that room knew what they were really dealing with. "They're pushing epi," Mara said into the earpiece. "Tell them to stop." "We don't have comm access inside the trauma bay." "Then I need to move faster." She walked, not ran. Running would draw attention from anyone watching the security cameras, and if Wolf had people inside the hospital, those cameras were compromised. She walked with purpose and the medical case in her hand, and she looked exactly like what she was, a nurse responding to an emergency. The double doors to Trauma Bay 1 were propped open. She could see inside, the cluster of bodies around the gurney, the frantic energy of a code blue that wasn't responding to treatment. Dr. Patel was doing chest compressions. A respiratory therapist was bagging the Admiral manually. 2 nurses were pushing drugs that wouldn't help. And Julian Wolfe was standing 3 feet from the bed, arms crossed, watching. Just watching. Mara's stomach turned. She knew that posture. She'd seen it once before. A man standing outside a tent at Kestrel, arms folded the same way, watching through the flap as 11 people died inside. She hadn't been able to see his face then. The tent had been dim and she'd been on the floor, crawling through her own vomit, the toxin in her system fighting the counteragent she'd injected into her own thigh with hands that could barely close around the syringe. She'd survived because she'd recognized the symptoms 60 seconds faster than everyone else. 60 seconds. The margin between Mara Sinclair alive and Mara Sinclair in a sealed casket with a flag draped over it. "He's not going to respond to epi," Patel was saying, sweat running down his temples. "I've given him 3 rounds. Nothing. What the hell is—" "Sometimes the damage is too extensive," Wolfe said. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. We've done everything we can. His troponin levels don't match a standard MI. The enzyme pattern is, Dr. Patel. Wolf's voice hardened, just enough. I've seen this before. Atypical presentation in elderly patients with prior bypass history. The heart is failing. We need to prepare the family. He doesn't have family here. His military detail. Then we prepare them. Call it. Patel hesitated. His hands were still on the Admiral's chest. He didn't want to stop. Mara could see it, the reluctance, the instinct that something was off, fighting against the institutional gravity that told him the chief of surgery was always right. Mara stepped through the doors. Don't stop compressions, she said. Every head snapped toward her. Wolf's body went rigid, a full-body flinch that he covered in half a second, but Mara saw it. She saw it and filed it away in the part of her brain that was already building a case. What the? Val, the charge nurse, stepped forward. You can't be in here. You were terminated. Security. His blood pH is crashing because you're pushing epinephrine into a system that's been flooded with a synthetic cardiotoxin, Mara said, moving toward the bed. She set the case down on the supply table and opened it. Every round of epi is accelerating the compound's effect on his cardiac tissue. You're killing him faster. Someone get her out of here, Wolf said. His voice was still controlled, but the edges were fraying. Now, Dr. Patel. Mara looked directly at the attending. Not at Wolf, at Patel. Pull up his tox panel. Look at the metabolic acidosis markers. They're not consistent with myocardial infarction. They're consistent with exogenous cardiotoxic exposure. You know I'm right. You said it yourself. The enzyme pattern doesn't match. Patel's hand stopped on the Admiral's chest. He looked at her, then at Wolf, then at the monitor. She's a fired nurse having a breakdown, Wolf said. This is a security issue. Then why is his lactic acid at 14? Mara said. Why is his anion gap 42? Those numbers don't come from a heart attack, Dr. Wolf. Those numbers come from poisoning, and you know that because you're the one who put it in his IV. The room went silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that pushes against walls, that makes people hold their breath without deciding to. Wolf's face changed, not dramatically. He was too controlled for that. But something behind his eyes shifted, like a door closing. When he spoke again, his voice was ice. Dr. Patel, I am ordering you to remove this woman from my trauma bay and call hospital security immediately. She is delusional, she is dangerous, and she is interfering with— Federal agents are in the building, Mara said. Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. They're in the lobby right now, and they have the vial you used. She was bluffing. She didn't know if they had the vial yet, but she watched Wolf's left hand, the one hanging at his side, and she saw his fingers twitch, a micro-movement, involuntary, the hand of a man recalculating. I don't know what you think you're— Tetrodotoxyphenol, Mara said. Compound designation TX41, developed by Valcorp Industries under a DARPA subcontract in 2019. Mimics acute cardiac failure, undetectable on standard tox screens, lethal within 45 minutes of administration. Nobody moved. I know what it is because I watched it kill 11 people at Firebase Kestrel 4 years ago. 11 members of my unit, Dr. Wolf. My friends. My team. Her voice didn't break. She wouldn't give him that. The attack was staged, the poisoning was real, and the man who sold our location and supply manifest to get it done. This is insane, Wolf said, but his voice had climbed half an octave. This woman is standing in this room pretending to be a surgeon. Patel was staring at Wolf now. So was Val. So was every nurse and tech in the room. The air had changed. Something fundamental had cracked in the social architecture of the space. The assumption that the man in charge was trustworthy, that the hierarchy was there to protect them, that the quiet nurse who made no trouble was the one who didn't belong. Mara pulled the prepped syringe from the case. I can save this man, but I need you to step back, stop the epidrip, and let me administer the counteragent. The sequence takes 7 minutes. If I'm wrong, his tox panel will prove it, and you can have me arrested. If I'm right— She looked at Wolf. You'll have bigger problems than a fired nurse. Patel made his decision in 3 seconds. Later, when asked about it at the federal inquiry, he would say it was the numbers that convinced him. The anion gap, the lactic acid, the enzyme pattern that he'd flagged and Wolf had waved away. But truthfully, what convinced him was the look on Wolf's face, the look of a man who'd been caught and was running the calculations on how to get out. "Step back, Dr. Wolf," Patel said. "Excuse me? I'm the attending of record on this patient. I'm exercising my clinical authority. Step back from the bed." Wolf didn't move. For a long, horrible moment, the two men stared at each other, the chief of surgery and the attending physician, the institutional heavyweight and the mid-career doctor who'd never once pushed back against authority in his entire career. Patel didn't blink. "Now." Wolf stepped back. One step, two. His eyes never left Mara. She didn't waste time being afraid. She moved to the bedside and clamped the epi-drip. Her hands found the Admiral's central line, Wolf's central line, which was at least properly placed, and she began the sodium bicarbonate push. "I need someone to hold manual compressions at 60 per minute," she said. "Not faster, 60. Count with me if you have to." A young nurse, Mara didn't know her name, some recent hire, wide-eyed and shaking, stepped up to the bedside and placed her hands on the Admiral's sternum. "What's your name?" Mara asked, not looking up from the IV. "Tessa." "Okay, Tessa, you're going to compress on my count. Steady rhythm. Don't stop until I tell you, no matter what the monitor does. The rhythm is going to look worse before it looks better. That's normal. Trust the count." "Okay." Tessa's voice was thin, but her hands were in the right position. Mara began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. The bicarb entered the line. On the monitor, the Admiral's rhythm stuttered, a jagged line that looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. Val sucked in a breath. Patel's hand moved toward the crash cart by reflex. "Don't touch the cart," Mara said, still counting. 7, 8, 9, 10. This is the pH shift. The compound is destabilizing. His heart is going to fibrillate. That's what we want." "That's what we want?" Val said, her voice pitched high. "The toxin binds to cardiac muscle in an acidic environment. If I alkalize his blood fast enough, the binding weakens. The fibrillation means it's working. The compound is losing its grip." 15, 16, 17. "But I have about a 90-second window before the tissue damage becomes permanent, so I need everyone in this room to shut up and let me work." Nobody spoke. Mara finished the bicarb push and transitioned to the atropine. The syringe was smaller. The margin for error was thinner. She watched the monitor with the kind of focused intensity that burned everything else away. Wolf, the room, the hospital, the 14 months of being invisible, all of it gone. There was only the rhythm on the screen and the drugs in her hands, and the memory of the one time she'd done this before, in a tent that smelled like blood and sand, on a body that had already gone cold because she'd started 30 seconds too late. Not this time. She pushed the atropine. The rhythm changed again, from fibrillation to something chaotic and unreadable, the kind of tracing that made experienced cardiologists reach for the defibrillator and the crash cart Bible. "Don't shock him," Mara said. "Tessa, keep compressing. Steady. You're doing great." Tessa was crying, silent tears running down her cheeks and falling onto the Admiral's hospital gown. She didn't stop compressing. Then the potassium chloride. Half concentration. This was the part that had to be perfect, not because the medicine was complicated, but because the timing was everything. Too fast, and the potassium would overwhelm the already damaged conduction system. Too slow, and the toxin would rebind before the potassium could stabilize the membrane potential. Mara titrated by hand. No pump. No calculated drip rate. She squeezed the syringe with her thumb, watching the monitor, feeling the resistance in the plunger, adjusting pressure in increments so small they were almost imaginary. The room held its breath. 1 minute. The rhythm was still chaos. 2 minutes. Something flickered. A pattern trying to emerge from the noise, like a signal buried in static. 3 minutes. The pattern strengthened. Not normal sinus rhythm. Not yet. But organized, purposeful, a heart remembering how to beat. 4 minutes. Mara emptied the last of the potassium and pulled the syringe out. She pressed 2 fingers to the Admiral's carotid artery and closed her eyes. Thump, thump, thump. Irregular, weak, but present. "Stop compressions," she said. Tessa lifted her hands. The monitor traced a line that was ugly and ragged and the most beautiful thing Mara had seen in 4 years. "He's in a junctional rhythm," Patel said, reading the monitor. His voice was hoarse. Bradycardic, but organized. BP is, he checked the cuff, 68/40, low but present. He's perfusing. He'll need a dopamine drip to support his pressure for the next 12 hours, Mara said. Standard dosing, no epi, no vasopressin, dopamine only. And he needs a clean tox panel drawn right now, not a standard screen, a military-grade GC mass spec analysis. It'll pick up the metabolites. I'll order it, Patel said. He looked at her. Actually looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her. How did you know all of this? Before she could answer, she felt movement behind her, a current of displaced air. The instinct fired before the thought formed. Her body registered the threat a full second before her conscious mind caught up. She turned. Wolf was 2 feet away and closing. His right hand held a scalpel from the instrument tray. Small, sharp, the kind used for subcutaneous incisions. His eyes had the flat, focused look of a man who'd stopped calculating and started acting. Mara didn't think. She grabbed his wrist with both hands and twisted, hard, inward, the way she'd been taught at Fort Bragg during combatives training, the way she'd practiced 10,000 times until the motion lived in her tendons and not her brain. The scalpel clattered to the floor. Wolf grunted in pain and his knees buckled as she applied downward pressure on the joint. She brought him to the floor in under 2 seconds. Val screamed. Patel lurched backward. Tessa stood frozen at the bedside with her bloody gloves still raised. Mara pinned Wolf's arm behind his back, her knee on his spine, her hand flat on the back of his skull, pressing his face into the tile. He struggled. He was bigger, stronger, and his body was flooded with the kind of adrenaline that makes rational people do irrational things. But Mara had leverage and training and something else, something harder to name, the cold, controlled fury of a woman who'd been waiting 4 years for this moment without knowing it. "Don't move," she said. "You're assaulting." I said don't move. The trauma bay doors burst open. Agent Reeves came through first, weapon drawn, followed by 2 more agents in tactical vests. Behind them, Okafor entered with the calm authority of someone who'd been listening to everything through the earpiece and had timed her entrance to the second. "Dr. Julian Wolf," Okafor said, standing over him as Mara held him down. "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Rear Admiral Lawrence Beckett, the murder of 11 U.S. service members at Firebase Kestrel, conspiracy to commit espionage, and obstruction of a federal investigation." Reeves pulled Wolf's wrists behind his back and applied handcuffs. Mara released her hold and stood up. Her knee ached. Her hands were trembling again, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump, the crash that always comes after the body burns through its emergency reserves. She stepped back from Wolf's body on the floor and almost bumped into the supply cart. Someone's hand caught her elbow, Tessa, the young nurse, steadying her without being asked. "Are you okay?" Tessa whispered. Mara looked at her. 23, maybe 24. A year ago, she could have been Danny Flores, young, earnest, in over her head, doing the right thing anyway. "I'm fine," Mara said. She wasn't sure that was true. Agents pulled Wolf to his feet. His face was red from the tile, and a thin line of blood ran from a cut above his eyebrow. He looked at Mara with an expression she'd carry with her for years. Not hatred, not fear, but something more like recognition. The look of someone seeing a person clearly for the first time. "You were at Kestrel," he said. "You survived." Mara didn't answer. "I didn't know anyone survived." Okafor stepped between them. "Get him out of here." 2 agents walked Wolf through the doors, past the nurses' station, past the staff who'd lined the corridor to watch, past Carol Ashworth, who was standing at the end of the hallway in her gray blazer with a face the color of old paper. Okafor turned to Ashworth. "Ms. Ashworth, we'll need your office for the next several hours, and your phone, and your computer, and a detailed explanation of the 7 wire transfers from Valcorp Industries to your personal account over the past 32 months. Ashworth's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Agent Delgado will escort you. I'd advise cooperation." Mara watched Ashworth being led away and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not anger, not vindication. Just a vast, hollow tiredness, the kind that lives in your bones and won't leave with sleep. She turned back to the Admiral. Patel was adjusting the dopamine drip, working carefully, checking the rate against the protocol Mara had described. The monitor showed a stabilizing rhythm, still ugly, still fragile, but holding. He's going to need continuous monitoring for the next 24 hours, Mara said. The metabolites take time to clear. His kidneys will be under stress. Watch his creatinine and BUN every 2 hours. If his potassium drifts above 5.5, he'll need kayexalate, but don't correct it too aggressively, Patel finished. I know. He paused. I should have listened to you the first time. Yes, Mara said. You should have. It wasn't gracious. It wasn't the noble thing to say. But it was true. And Mara was finished saying the thing that made other people comfortable instead of the thing that was real. Patel took it. He nodded once and went back to work. Okafor appeared beside Mara in the hallway outside the trauma bay. The corridor had cleared. Staff had been pushed back to their stations by the agents, and the normal midnight hush of a hospital was reasserting itself, though it felt different now. Charged. Like the building itself was holding its breath. We need to debrief, Okafor said. Right now? In the next hour. There are things you need to know, and there are things we need from you. Such as? Okafor walked, and Mara walked with her. They moved through the corridor toward a conference room that agents had already commandeered. The table inside was covered with laptops, encrypted phones, and manila folders thick enough to serve as doorstops. Wolf didn't act alone, Okafor said, closing the door behind them. The operation at Kestrel, the cover-up, the placement at this hospital, it's a network. Military, political, private sector. We've been building this case for 2 years, and every time we get close to a critical witness, something goes wrong. Wrong how? Admiral Beckett is the 4th person connected to the Black Ridge testimony who's been targeted in the last 18 months. The first was a retired colonel, car accident in Virginia. Looked clean until our forensics team found the brake lines had been chemically degraded with a compound that dissolves after exposure to moisture. The second was a defense analyst, apparent suicide. Except the toxicology came back showing trace amounts of a sedative that isn't commercially available. The third was a military JAG officer who was preparing legal motions to unseal the Kestrel files. She disappeared from a parking garage in Arlington 6 months ago. We still haven't found her. Mara sat down. The chair was the kind they had in every hospital conference room, rigid, unyielding, designed for 15-minute meetings about scheduling conflicts and hand hygiene compliance. You said you've been building this for 2 years. Who are you building it against? Okafor opened one of the folders. Inside were photographs, financial records, organizational charts with lines connecting names and entities in a web that covered the entire table. Valcorp Industries is the center. CEO Harrison Voss, former Pentagon liaison, now one of the most politically connected defense contractors in the country. His company holds $11.3 billion in active government contracts. Weapons systems, surveillance tech, chemical research. The unauthorized weapons test your unit stumbled onto at Kestrel? That was Valcorp. An experimental area denial compound being tested on a civilian population in a region where Valcorp had brokered an illegal arms agreement with both sides of the conflict. Both sides. They were selling to the government we were supporting and to the insurgency we were fighting, simultaneously. Different compounds, different delivery systems, same bottom line. Your medical unit treated casualties from both sides. The chemical signatures in their blood work would have exposed the entire operation. Mara stared at the organizational chart. Names she didn't recognize, institutions she did. Defense agencies, Senate subcommittees, intelligence directorates. You said political, she said. How political? Okafor hesitated. It was the first time Mara had seen her pause. 2 sitting senators serve on the Armed Services Committee and have direct financial ties to Valcorp. Senator Richard Hale and Senator Diane Pruitt. Hale's campaign received $4.7 million from Valcorp-affiliated PACs over 2 election cycles. Pruitt's husband is a managing partner at a law firm that represents Valcorp's international subsidiaries. Both senators voted to classify the Kestrel incident and block congressional review. They knew. At minimum, they were aware that the classification served Valcorp's interests. Whether they had direct knowledge of the poisoning is what Beckett's testimony was meant to establish. Okafor closed the folder, which is why Wolf was activated tonight. Beckett's testimony would have blown the door open. Names, dates, operational details. He was the commanding officer overseeing the region where your unit was deployed. He authorized the investigation into the chemical anomalies your medics reported. And someone, Wolf, Voss, the senators, or all of them, decided he couldn't be allowed to speak. Mara looked at the closed folder, then at Okafor. You said you need things from me. What things? Your testimony. Your medical records from Kestrel. Your first-hand account of the symptoms, the timeline, the deaths. You're the only surviving witness who can connect the compound used at Kestrel to the compound used on Beckett tonight. You're the proof that it's the same weapon, the same source, the same network. And if I testify, I become the fifth target. Okafor didn't sugarcoat it. Yes, Mara thought about this. She thought about the apartment she'd go home to, a studio in Uptown with a mattress on the floor and a single plant on the windowsill that she kept alive out of spite. She thought about the fact that she had no family who called anymore, no friends outside the hospital that had just fired her, no life that anyone would describe as worth protecting. And then she thought about Danny Flores, Keiko Watanabe, Marcus Ridley, 9 other names she knew better than her own heartbeat. I'll testify, she said, but I have conditions. Okafor raised an eyebrow. I want access to Beckett during his recovery. I want to be present for every medical decision made about his care. I know the compound, I know the after effects, and I don't trust anyone in this hospital to manage it without me. Done. And I want the Kestrel files. All of them. Not the redacted versions, not the summaries. The originals. I want to see what really happened, not the version they wrote to protect themselves. Okafor studied her for a long moment. Some of what's in those files is going to be hard to read. I was there. I don't need to read about it to know it was hard. Fair enough. I'll arrange clearance. A knock at the conference room door. Agent Reeves entered with a tablet. Ma'am, we've got a problem. What kind? Wolf made a phone call before we got to him, from the trauma bay, about 90 seconds before Sinclair arrived. Short burst, 8 seconds, to a prepaid number. NSA is tracing it, but the preliminary ping puts the receiving device within a 3-mile radius of this hospital. Mara's stomach dropped. Okafor stood. He called it in, the failsafe. What failsafe? Mara asked. If Beckett survived the poisoning, there was a backup plan, a team. Wolf was the first option, quiet, clinical, deniable. The team is the second option. What kind of team? Okafor looked at her. The kind that doesn't worry about being quiet. As if the building itself had heard her, the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. A total instantaneous blackout that swallowed the corridor, the conference room, and, from the shouts echoing through the walls, every floor of Ridgemont Memorial Hospital. Emergency generators kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in a thin red-tinged glow that turned familiar hallways into something from a fever dream. The conference room's overhead light buzzed and caught at half power, casting long shadows across the walls. Okafor's hand went to her weapon. Reeves, get me a status on all entry points, now. Reeves was already on his radio. All teams, report. Perimeter status. The radio answered in fragments. North entrance, secure. South entrance, secure. East service dock, static. East team, report. Reeves's voice was sharp. East team, come in. Nothing. Mara was already moving. She didn't decide to move. Her body made the decision for her, the way it had at Kestrel when the first man dropped, and her training took over before her mind could catch up. She was at the conference room door, hand on the handle, when Okafor caught her arm. Where you think you're going? The East Service entrance is 2 corridors from Trauma 1. If they're coming in through the East dock, they're coming for Beckett. I have agents. Your East team just went dark. How many did you have there? Okafor's jaw tightened. 2. Then you have 0 now. A sound echoed through the hospital, distant, muffled by walls and doors, but unmistakable to anyone who'd heard it before. A suppressed gunshot, that flat pneumatic cough that movies always get wrong. Then another. Then 2 more in rapid succession. Screams followed. Staff, patients, visitors. The hospital erupting in the primal chaos of people who don't know what's happening but know it's bad. Okafor pulled her weapon. Reeves, pull all perimeter teams to Trauma 1. Priority 1 is the Admiral. No one gets to him. I need a weapon, Mara said. You're a civilian. I'm a former combat medic with advanced tactical training and a service record that your agency has apparently been reading for 2 years. I'm also the only person in this building who knows the layout well enough to get to Trauma 1 faster than whoever just came through the East Dock. Another shot. Closer. Okafor reached to her ankle holster and pulled a compact Glock 26. She checked the chamber, engaged the safety, and held it out grip first. Rules of engagement. Defensive only. You protect the Admiral. You protect yourself. You do not go hunting. Mara took the weapon. It was lighter than what she was used to. At Kestrel, she'd carried a standard-issue M9, heavier, uglier, more forgiving. The Glock felt like a toy in her hand, but a functional toy. She press-checked the chamber, verified the magazine, and released the safety in a sequence so smooth it could have been choreographed. Okafor watched her do it with the expression of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed. There's a maintenance corridor that runs behind the east wing, Mara said. Staff use it to move laundry carts between floors. It's not on the standard blueprints. They added it during the 2019 renovation. Comes out 12 feet from Trauma 1's back entrance. How do you know that? Because I used to eat lunch in it when I wanted to be alone, which was every day. Mara moved into the hallway. The red emergency lights turned her shadow into something long and wrong against the wall. I need 3 minutes. She didn't wait for permission. She was already gone. The maintenance corridor was exactly where she remembered. Through the supply closet behind the nurse's station, past the industrial washing machines that hummed even in blackout mode because they ran on a separate circuit, through a fire door that was supposed to be alarmed but hadn't been since the battery died 6 months ago. Mara had reported it twice. Maintenance had never fixed it. She moved through this dark by feel and memory. The Glock was in a two-handed grip, barrel down, the way Sergeant Instructor Koenig had drilled into her during 12 weeks of tactical medical training at Fort Bragg. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for a laundry cart, and it smelled like industrial detergent and hot dryer lint. She counted her steps. 72 from the fire door to the junction, left turn, 40 more to the access panel that opened behind the supply cabinet in Trauma 1's prep area. She reached the panel and stopped, pressed her ear against it, listened. Voices. Low, controlled, professional. Not hospital staff. Hospital staff would be panicking, shouting, calling for help. These voices were giving commands in clipped syllables. 3 distinct voices. Maybe 4. She heard something else. Footsteps. Tactical boots on hospital tile. The distinctive sound of men who knew how to move through a building without making more noise than they intended. They were already inside Trauma 1. Mara closed her eyes. Breathed. When she opened them, something had changed in her face. A settling, a hardening, like watching water turn to ice. The nurse was still there, somewhere underneath, but the person standing in that maintenance corridor in the red-tinged dark, holding a borrowed Glock with hands that had finally stopped shaking. That person was someone else entirely, someone she hadn't been in 4 years, someone she'd hoped she'd never have to be again. She pressed the access panel with her left hand, felt it give slightly under the pressure, and eased it open 1 inch at a time. Through the gap, she could see the prep area, empty, lit only by the red emergency glow. Beyond it, through the interior window, Trauma 1. 4 men. Black tactical gear, balaclavas, suppressed rifles. 2 were covering the main entrance. 1 was disconnecting the Admiral's monitors. The 4th was standing over the gurney, reaching for the IV line, reaching to finish what Wolf had started. Tessa was on the floor against the far wall, hands over her head, sobbing silently. Dr. Patel was beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face a mask of controlled terror. 2 agents lay motionless near the door. Whether dead or incapacitated, Mara couldn't tell. The man at the gurney pulled a syringe from his vest. Small, unmarked. Mara recognized the color of the liquid inside, and something inside her chest turned to granite. She pushed through the access panel, stepped into the prep area, raised the Glock, and put her front sight on the man holding the syringe. "Drop it," she said. Her voice was flat and steady and loud enough to carry. "Drop it right now." 4 weapons swung toward her simultaneously. 4 red dots danced across her chest. The man with the syringe froze, his hand hovering 6 inches from the Admiral's IV port. Nobody moved. The cardiac monitor beeped. The Admiral's fragile heart pushed blood through damaged vessels, unaware that its survival was being decided by a woman in coffee-stained scrubs standing in a doorway with a borrowed gun and no backup. The man with the syringe tilted his head. Behind the balaclava, she could see his eyes, calm, professional, assessing. He was calculating how fast she could fire, whether she would, whether she was bluffing. Mara's index finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger. Her breathing was slow. 4 years ago, she'd been a medic who carried a weapon because regulations required it. She'd fired it at qualifying ranges and hoped she'd never fire it anywhere else. That woman felt very far away. "I've been here before," she said quietly, "and I pulled through." The man with the syringe looked at her for a long time. Then he smiled behind his mask. She could see it in the way his eyes creased, and moved his hand closer to the IV port. Mara shifted her aim 2 inches to the left, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The round punched through the syringe and took 2 of the man's fingers with it. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. Not the suppressed cough of their weapons, but the full, unsilenced crack of a Glock 26 inside a room made of tile and glass and stainless steel. It hit like a physical force. Tessa screamed. The cardiac monitor spiked. The syringe exploded into fragments of plastic and amber liquid that sprayed across the Admiral's gurney and the wall behind it, and the man stumbled backward, clutching a hand that was suddenly missing pieces. The other 3 operators reacted in the span of a heartbeat, 2 pivoting toward Mara, 1 dropping to check his wounded teammate. She was already moving, not forward, not backward, but sideways toward the heavy supply cabinet that separated the prep area from the main bay. She'd stalked that cabinet 100 times. She knew it was steel-framed, bolted to the wall, heavy enough to stop a rifle round if she was lucky, and slow one down if she wasn't. 2 suppressed shots splintered the doorframe where she'd been standing a half-second earlier. Drywall dust clouded the air. Mara dropped behind the cabinet and pressed her back against its cold steel surface. The Glock held tight against her chest. Her ears were ringing from her own shot. Her pulse was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. 3 operators still standing, 1 wounded but mobile. She checked the magazine by touch, counting the rounds with her thumb. 9 rounds left. They had suppressed rifles, body armor, night vision capability, and the training to use all of it. The math was bad. "Contact rear," one of them barked. "Single shooter, prep area. Move to secondary extraction." Secondary extraction. They had a backup plan. They always had a backup plan. Men like this didn't walk into hospitals without 3 ways out and a contingency for each one. If she stayed pinned behind the cabinet, they'd either flank her or abandon the primary objective and extract through an alternate route. Either way, she lost. She needed to change the equation. "Patel," she shouted, "get Beckett's gurney against the west wall, away from the door." She didn't know if he'd heard her, didn't know if he could move, didn't know if the operators would let him. But she heard the squeak of wheels on tile. Someone was moving the gurney. Patel or Tessa or both, dragging a dying man across a room full of armed killers because a fired nurse told them to. The 2 operators covering the main entrance were her immediate problem. They'd positioned themselves well, one behind the crash cart, one at the edge of a structural pillar, and they had overlapping fields of fire that covered both the prep area and the gurney's new position. She couldn't reach Beckett without crossing their line of sight. But they'd made one mistake. They were facing inward, toward her, toward the patient, with their backs to the main corridor, where Okafor's agents were about to arrive. Mara keyed the earpiece. "Okafor, I'm in Trauma 1, 4 hostiles, 1 wounded. They're set up facing south toward the prep area. Your approach is from the north corridor. They don't have rear coverage." Static. Then Okafor's voice, strained and tight. "We're 90 seconds out. 2 agents down in the east wing. I'm coming with Reeves and a 3-man team." 90 seconds is too long. "It's what I have." Mara exhaled. 90 seconds. She needed to keep 4 armed men pinned and distracted for 90 seconds while simultaneously keeping them away from a critically ill patient whose cardiac rhythm was being held together by drugs and willpower. She looked around the prep area. Medical supplies. IV poles. A crash cart backup unit. An oxygen tank. Large, industrial. The kind that weighed 60 pounds and could sustain a ventilator for 12 hours. An oxygen tank. She grabbed it. It was mounted to the wall with a quick release bracket, and she popped it free with one hand while keeping the Glock in the other. The tank was awkward and heavy, and her shoulders screamed from the weight, but she got it to the floor and positioned it at the edge of the cabinet. She wasn't going to shoot it. That was a movie fantasy. Oxygen tanks don't explode from bullet impacts. But 60 pounds of pressurized steel rolling across a tile floor in a dark room makes noise. It creates confusion. It buys seconds. She aimed the valve toward the main bay, cranked it to full release, and shoved. The tank rocketed across the floor like a battering ram, riding a jet of compressed oxygen that turned it into a spinning, screaming projectile. It slammed into the crash cart with a sound like a car accident, scattering equipment and defibrillator paddles and drug trays in every direction. The operator behind the cart dove sideways, his rifle swinging wildly. The second operator at the pillar jerked his weapon toward the noise, instinct overriding training for one critical second. Mara stood, stepped out from behind the cabinet, and fired 3 rounds in quick succession. The first caught the pillar operator in the shoulder, above the body armor's coverage area. He spun and dropped to one knee, his rifle clattering against the pillar. The second round hit the crash cart operator's weapon, a ricochet that sent the rifle skittering across the floor. The third went wide. Mara's hands weren't as steady as they'd been at Fort Bragg, and the Glock's short barrel amplified every tremor. The wounded operator near the gurney, the one missing fingers, raised his sidearm left-handed. He was shaking, bleeding badly, his shooting hand a ruined mess of torn tissue. But he was pointing the weapon at Beckett's gurney, at the unconscious Admiral, whose fragile heartbeat was the only evidence that could bring down a billion-dollar conspiracy. "You shoot him, you lose your leverage," Mara said. She was standing in the open now, no cover, the cabinet behind her, 6 rounds left, 3 functional hostiles, and 1 wounded, exposed, stupid. The kind of tactical decision that would get her screamed at in any after-action review. But she wasn't making a tactical decision. She was making a human one. "We don't need leverage," the man said through his balaclava. His voice was clipped, Midwestern, professional. "We need him dead." "Then why haven't you pulled the trigger?" He didn't answer. Because the answer was obvious. He hadn't pulled the trigger because Mara was right. Beckett dead without the poisoning confirmed meant an investigation. Beckett dead with witnesses meant a cover-up. And 4 men in tactical gear murdering a retired admiral inside a hospital in front of a federal team was the kind of event that didn't get covered up, not even by people with $11 billion in government contracts. They needed it to look medical. They needed it to look natural. And Mara had already destroyed that option. "Your exit is the East Service dock," she said, reading their body language, their positioning, the way their eyes kept flicking toward the corridor behind them. "You came in from the parking structure through the loading bay. Your vehicle is in the basement level, probably a van with medical markings. You were supposed to be in and out in 4 minutes. Administer the compound, disconnect the monitors, walk out before anyone realized the blackout wasn't a power failure." The leader, the one at the pillar, now bleeding from his shoulder, still on one knee, stared at her. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm nobody. Ask anyone in this building, they'll tell you." Gunfire erupted from the north corridor. Sharp, controlled bursts, federal agents engaging. The 2 operators at the main entrance spun toward the sound, weapons up, caught between the threat behind them and the woman in front of them. Mara moved. She crossed the room in 5 steps. Not the smooth, cinematic sprint of someone who trains daily, but the ugly, adrenaline-fueled lurch of a woman running on no sleep and 14 hours of shift work in a body that was operating on reserves it shouldn't have had. She reached the gurney and put herself between Beckett and the wounded operator, her Glock level with his chest, close enough that body armor wouldn't matter. "Put it down," she said. Blood was pooling around his boots. His shooting hand was a catastrophe. 2 fingers gone, the palm torn, tendons exposed. He was pale, shocky. The left-handed grip on his sidearm was wavering, the barrel describing small, drunken circles. "I'll bleed out," he said. Not a plea, a statement. He was looking at his hand the way people look at a car accident, disbelief that this mangled thing belonged to them. "Put the weapon down and I'll stop the bleeding." He looked at her. Behind the balaclava, his eyes were young, mid-20s, the age of the soldiers she'd lost at Kestrel. He put the weapon down. Mara kicked it under the gurney, holstered the Glock in her waistband, and grabbed a compression bandage from the supply cart that Tessa had somehow managed to wheel close during the chaos. She knelt beside the man who'd been sent to kill her patient and began wrapping his ruined hand with the focused efficiency of someone who'd treated worse injuries in worse conditions. "You're helping me," he said, bewildered. I'm a nurse, Mara said. That's what I do. The firefight in the corridor lasted another 40 seconds. Mara heard it in stages, the initial contact, the exchange, the movement, as Okafor's team pushed forward, and then the sudden silence that meant it was over. When the trauma bay doors opened this time, it was Reeves who came through first, his weapon sweeping the room in practiced arcs before lowering when he saw Mara kneeling beside the wounded operator. Room is clear, Mara said without looking up. One hostile down, one wounded and secured, two engaged in the corridor. Okafor entered behind Reeves. She took in the scene, the shattered crash cart, the oxygen tank wedged against the far wall, the spent casings on the tile, the blood, the unconscious Admiral on the gurney with his monitors still beeping their fragile rhythm, and her expression went through a series of rapid adjustments that ended somewhere between professional acknowledgement and something that, on a different face, might have been awe. Status on Beckett? She asked. Mara checked the monitor while she tied off the compression bandage. Holding. Junctional rhythm, rate 54. BP 72/46. He's stable, but barely. The dopamine drip wasn't interrupted. The other two hostiles surrendered in the corridor, wounded but alive. I need surgical supplies for this one, Mara said, nodding toward the operator she was treating. He's going to lose the hand if the tendons aren't addressed in the next hour, and even then it's a coin toss. Okafor looked down at the man on the floor, a man who'd been sent to murder a federal witness, who was now being bandaged by the woman he'd pointed a gun at. I'll have a trauma surgeon brought in from Minneapolis General, under federal escort. Not Wolf's people. Not Wolf's people. Mara stood, her knees cracked. She was aware, suddenly and completely, of how tired she was. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't live in muscles but in the space behind your eyes, in the place where you store the things you don't let yourself feel until the crisis is over. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in blood, the operators, from the bandaging, red and wet and real. She'd had blood on her hands before, at Kestrel, in the tent, trying to start Danny Flores' heart with chest compressions, while the toxin turned his blood to something that couldn't carry oxygen. She'd pressed and pressed and pressed, and his ribs had cracked under her palms, and he'd been dead for 10 minutes before she stopped. She walked to the sink in the prep area and turned on the water. It came out cold. The hospital's hot water heater must have been affected by the power cut. She washed her hands for a long time, longer than she needed to. The water ran pink, then clear, and she kept washing until her skin was raw and the shaking in her fingers had stopped. Okafor found her there. We need to move Beckett. This hospital isn't secure. Where? Walter Reed. We have the medical transport plane standing by at Minneapolis-St. Paul. It's a 4-hour flight. He'll have full cardiac monitoring and a federal medical team on board. I'm going with him. Okafor didn't argue. The team leaves in 90 minutes. We're sweeping the building floor by floor. Wolf may have had other assets embedded here that we haven't identified. He did, Mara said. She dried her hands on a paper towel and turned around. Carol Ashworth, the hospital director. You already have her, but there are others. How do you know? Because this hospital functioned perfectly as a machine designed to keep people like me invisible. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people in positions of authority are incentivized to look the other way. She paused. Check the chief of nursing, Linda Voss. Okafor's eyes sharpened. Voss? Same last name as your Valcorp CEO. I noticed it when I was hired. I told myself it was a coincidence. It wasn't, was it? Okafor pulled out her phone. Reeves, pull the personnel file for Linda Voss, chief of nursing. Run it against the Valcorp network chart. Now. While Okafor handled the new lead, Mara returned to Beckett's bedside. Patel was there, adjusting the dopamine drip with hands that were shaking badly enough that he'd had to try twice to set the rate. Tessa was beside him, holding an IV bag, tear tracks drying on her cheeks. He's holding, Patel said. But his creatinine is climbing, kidney stress, like you predicted. Mara checked the numbers. Start a low-dose fluid bolus. Normal saline, 200 mils per hour. We need to flush the metabolites without overloading his cardiovascular system. His heart can't take volume right now. Patel nodded and began programming the pump. Then he stopped. Mara, what you did, the oxygen tank, the shooting, where did that come from? She looked at him. The overhead emergency lights caught the exhaustion in her face, the hollows under her eyes, the coffee stains still on her scrub pants. She looked like what she was, a 31-year-old woman who'd been awake for 20 hours and had done things in the last 2 that she'd spent years trying to process. "From a place I wish didn't exist," she said. The hospital sweep took 70 minutes. In that time, Okafor's team identified 3 additional Valcorp-connected personnel: Linda Voss, who turned out to be Harrison Voss's niece, a biomedical equipment technician named Greer, who had access to the hospital's medication dispensing system, and a security supervisor who'd been responsible for disabling the East Wing cameras 30 minutes before the power cut. Linda Voss was found in her office, shredding documents. The shredder jammed on the 3rd pass, and when agents opened it, they found fragments of internal memos detailing medication substitutions, instances where drugs ordered for specific patients had been quietly swapped for compounds that Valcorp was testing in uncontrolled civilian environments. Ridgemont Memorial hadn't just been a hospital, it had been a laboratory. And the patients, the people who checked in for surgeries and treatments and routine procedures, had been the subjects. Mara learned this in the back of the federal SUV that was transporting her and Beckett to the airport. Okafor sat across from her, reading from a tablet, her face lit blue in the dark vehicle interior. "How many?" Mara asked. Okafor scrolled. "We don't have a full count yet. The memos reference at least 47 patients over a 32-month period. Medication substitutions, unauthorized compound testing, falsified records." "How many died?" "We're cross-referencing patient outcomes now. Initial review shows 11 unexpected deaths that were attributed to surgical complications or pre-existing conditions." 11. The same number as Kestrel. Mara didn't know if that was coincidence or design, and the part of her that might have cared about the distinction had gone numb somewhere between the firefight and the hand-washing. "Valcorp used the hospital as a testing site," she said. Not a question. "It appears so." Wolf was the medical director of the program. Ashworth provided administrative cover. Linda Voss managed the nursing assignments to ensure that patients in the study were handled by staff who wouldn't ask questions. "Staff like me." Okafor looked up from the tablet. "That's why they kept me on floor duty. That's why Ellison told me to stay in my lane. That's why no one listened when I flagged errors. They weren't errors. They were the program." Mara's voice was flat, the way flat things are when they're being held down by enormous pressure. "Every time I caught something wrong, I was catching evidence of what they were doing. And every time they told me to shut up, they were protecting the operation. Your instincts were right the entire time. My instincts cost me 14 months of being treated like I was stupid, of being told I was overstepping, of going home every night wondering if I was the problem." She pressed her forehead against the cold window of the SUV. Outside, Minneapolis was dark and silent at 3 a.m., the streetlights casting orange pools on empty roads. "You know what the worst part is? I believed them. For a while. I actually believed that maybe I was too aggressive, too paranoid, too damaged from Kestrel to function in a normal environment." "You're not damaged," Okafor said. "Everyone who survives what I survived is damaged. The question is what you do with it." The convoy reached Minneapolis-St. Paul International at 3:47 a.m. The medical transport was a modified C-17 with a field hospital built into the cargo hold, military equipment repurposed for federal operations. 2 flight medics and an intensivist were waiting on the tarmac. Mara supervised the transfer of Beckett's gurney from the ambulance to the aircraft. She checked every connection, every IV line, every monitor lead, every drug pump setting. The intensivist, a lieutenant commander named Ibarra, watched her work with the measured patience of someone who was used to being the most competent medical person in the room and was realizing gradually that tonight she wasn't. "What's his current rhythm?" Ibarra asked. "Junctional, rate 58, improved from 54 about 40 minutes ago, which suggests the conduction system is recovering but slowly. His biggest risk right now is renal failure. The metabolites are nephrotoxic, and his creatinine has been climbing steadily. I started a saline bolus at Ridgemont, but he's going to need aggressive hydration support and possibly dialysis if his numbers don't stabilize in the next 6 hours." "And the counteragent? You administered a field protocol?" "It's not in any manual. I learned it from a military pharmacologist who developed the antidote specifically for this compound. He was one of the 11 killed at Kestrel." Ibarra absorbed this. "I'll follow your protocol. You lead. I'll support." Mara looked at her. Really looked at her. The way she'd been looking at people all night, trying to determine who was trustworthy and who was another link in a chain of betrayal. Ibarra looked back, steady, open. The look of a military medical officer who understood that rank and ego had no place in a patient's care. "Thank you," Mara said. The words came out rough, unpracticed. She hadn't thanked anyone in a long time because no one had done anything worth thanking. The C-17 lifted off at 4:12 a.m. Mara sat in a jump seat beside Beckett's gurney, watching the cardiac monitor the way a new mother watches a sleeping infant, constant, unblinking, alert to every variation in the rhythm. The aircraft's vibration ran through the floor and into her legs, and the engine noise was a low, steady roar that covered everything else. Somewhere over Wisconsin, Beckett's eyes opened, not fully, not coherently. A slit of pale gray iris behind swollen lids, unfocused, searching. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. The oxygen mask muffled whatever he was trying to say. Mara leaned closer. "Admiral Beckett, you're on a medical transport. You're stable. Don't try to talk." His eyes found her face. Held. Something moved behind them. Recognition, maybe, or the effort of a mind trying to surface through layers of sedation and trauma, and the residual fog of a compound that had tried to stop his heart. He lifted his hand. Trembling, IV lines trailing, the skin paper-thin and mottled with bruises from the resuscitation. He reached toward her, and she took his hand without thinking about it, wrapped her fingers around his and held on. He squeezed. Weak but deliberate. Then his eyes closed again. Mara sat holding an unconscious Admiral's hand at 30,000 feet and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not pain exactly, but the release of something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. At Kestrel, she'd held Danny Flores' hand the same way. But Danny had been dead. His fingers had been cooling, and she'd held on anyway, for minutes that felt like hours, because letting go meant accepting that it had really happened. Beckett was warm. His pulse was there, under her thumb, faint and irregular but stubbornly present. She'd saved him. She'd actually saved him. She didn't cry, not yet. That would come later, in a bathroom at Walter Reed, at 4 o'clock on some afternoon when the adrenaline had finally metabolized and the walls she'd built came down all at once. But right now, at 30,000 feet, she allowed herself one small thing. She closed her eyes, and for 30 seconds, she didn't watch the monitor. They landed at Joint Base Andrews at 8:03 a.m. Eastern. The tarmac was wet with overnight rain, and the sky was the color of old aluminum. A military ambulance was waiting, along with a security escort of 3 vehicles and 8 armed personnel. Beckett was transferred to the ambulance with precision and urgency, and Mara climbed in beside him and didn't look back at the aircraft or the airfield or the night she was leaving behind. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center was everything Ridgemont Memorial was not. Enormous, fortified, staffed by people who understood that some patients carried secrets in their bloodstream. Beckett was admitted to a secured wing on the 3rd floor, behind a door that required a key card and a biometric scan, and 2 Marines standing on either side who looked like they'd been specifically selected for their ability to discourage casual visitors. Mara was given a room down the hall. Not a patient room, a staff room, the kind reserved for visiting physicians, with a narrow bed and a desk and a window that looked out on a gray parking lot. She didn't sleep. She showered, changed into clean scrubs that someone had left on the bed, and went back to Beckett's room to check his numbers. Creatinine was still climbing. Not as fast, but the trajectory was wrong. She found Ibarra in the hallway. "He needs dialysis. His kidneys aren't clearing the metabolites fast enough. Nephrology consult is scheduled for noon. Move it up. By noon, his creatinine will be above 6 and will be chasing damage instead of preventing it." Ibarra made a call. Nephrology arrived at 9:45 a.m. Dialysis started at 10:30. While the machine did its work, Mara sat in Beckett's room and read the Kestrel files. Okafor had delivered them on a secure tablet. 347 pages of classified documents, operational reports, medical records, intelligence briefings, and financial transactions. The originals, not the redacted versions. The truth, not the story. She read for 4 hours. She didn't take breaks. The picture that emerged was worse than what she'd imagined during 4 years of nightmares. Operation Blackridge had been a joint military-private venture authorized by a classified executive memorandum, not signed by the president, but by a deputy secretary of defense who had since retired to a consulting position at Valcorp. The operation's stated purpose was field testing of non-lethal area denial compounds in active conflict zones. Its actual purpose was testing weaponized chemical agents on civilian populations to generate efficacy data that Valcorp could use to bid on a $23 billion NATO defense contract. Mara's unit, the 47th Forward Medical Support Team, had been deployed to provide medical coverage for coalition forces in the region. They'd treated casualties from both sides of the conflict, as combat medics do, and in doing so, they'd drawn blood samples, run field diagnostics, and documented chemical signatures that matched the compounds Valcorp was testing. They'd filed reports, through proper channels, to their commanding officer, who'd forwarded them up the chain to Admiral Lawrence Beckett, the regional commander. Beckett had ordered an investigation. Valcorp had ordered a cleanup. The operational file for the cleanup was 17 pages long. It detailed the logistics of poisoning 11 military medical personnel while staging a mortar attack to provide cover. The compound, TX41, tetradoxaphenol, had been introduced through the unit's water supply. Not the main water tank, which was tested regularly, but the secondary purification system that fed the medical tent's hand-washing stations. The medics had absorbed it through their skin. Mara read her own medical file. She read the note from the field pharmacologist, Dr. Alan Ostrowski, the man who'd developed the counteragent, the man who'd injected her with it before the toxin reached lethal concentration in her blood, the man who'd then died because he'd used the last dose on her instead of on himself. She read the timestamp. He'd injected her at 0347 hours. He'd died at 0419 hours. 32 minutes. He'd had 32 minutes to save himself and he'd chosen her instead. She hadn't known that. They'd never told her. The official report said he'd died in the mortar attack, like everyone else. A casualty of enemy fire. Not a man who'd made a choice. She set the tablet down and stared at the wall. Something inside her, something load-bearing, something she'd been leaning on without knowing it, shifted. Not collapsed, shifted, like a foundation stone moving an inch, changing the angle of everything built on top of it. Alan Ostrowski had saved her life, and she'd spent 4 years thinking she'd survived by luck, by reflex, by the kind of random chance that makes some people live and others die. And all that time, the truth had been sealed in a classified file behind a redaction that turned a man's sacrifice into a bureaucratic line item. She picked up the tablet again. She kept reading. At 6 p.m., Okafor knocked on Beckett's door and entered without waiting for an answer. She looked like she'd been awake for 30 hours, which she had, and she was carrying 2 paper cups of coffee that she set down on the side table with the careful precision of someone handling sensitive material. Beckett's dialysis is working, Mara said. Creatinine is down to 4.2. Still elevated, but trending the right direction. His rhythm has improved. Sinus bradycardia now, rate 62. He's going to make it. Good. Because I need him alive for what's coming. Okafor sat down. We executed warrants on Valcorp's headquarters in Arlington 2 hours ago. 47 federal agents. Seized servers, financial records, research data, communication logs. Harrison Voss was taken into custody without incident. He lawyered up before we finished reading him his rights. Mara took one of the coffees. It was terrible. She drank it anyway. The Senate is scrambling, Okafor continued. Hale and Pruitt are issuing statements claiming they had no knowledge of Valcorp's illegal operations. Their offices are in full damage control. Do you have enough to charge them? We have financial records connecting them to Valcorp's classified testing program. We have communication logs showing they were briefed on the Kestrel cover-up within 72 hours of the poisoning. And we have... Okafor paused. We have video. Mara looked up. Valcorp maintained a surveillance system at their testing sites, part of the efficacy documentation, recording the effects of the compounds on exposed populations. The system was supposed to have been destroyed after each test cycle, but someone in their IT department kept backup copies. We recovered footage from Firebase Kestrel. The room was very quiet. The dialysis machine hummed. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady, stabilizing rhythm. There is footage of your unit, Okafor said carefully. The hours before and during the poisoning. It shows the water system being tampered with. It shows the onset of symptoms. It shows... Stop. Okafor stopped. Mara stared at the coffee cup in her hands. The surface of the liquid trembled, not from the building's ventilation system, but from her hands, which she couldn't keep still no matter how hard she pressed them together. "I don't need to see it," she said. "I was there." "I know, but the committee will see it, and I need you to be prepared for that." "What committee?" "The Armed Services Subcommittee on Emerging Threats. They've convened a closed hearing for next week. Beckett was supposed to testify before the attempt on his life. Now they want both of you." "Both of us." "His testimony establishes the command chain. Who authorized what? Who knew? Who covered it up? Your testimony establishes the ground truth. What the compound did, how your unit died, what you saw." Okafor leaned forward. "Mara, your testimony is the hinge. Without it, this is a financial crime case, contractor fraud, bribery, corruption. With it, this is murder. 11 counts of murder and attempted murder. That's the difference between fines and life sentences." Mara thought about Alan Ostrowski, about the 32 minutes he'd had and the choice he'd made, about the fact that his sacrifice had been classified, redacted, erased, turned into a line in a file that no one was supposed to read. "I'll testify," she said, "but I need those names." "What names?" "My unit. The 11 who died. I want their names read into the congressional record. I want every senator in that room to hear every name. I don't care if it takes an hour. Those people existed, and this system turned them into a rounding error, and I will not let that stand." Okafor studied her. "I'll make sure it happens." Outside the window, the sun had set over Walter Reed. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the wet pavement. Somewhere in the building, a retired admiral was pulling further from death with every passing hour, his blood slowly clearing, his heart slowly strengthening, his testimony slowly becoming inevitable. And somewhere in Arlington, Harrison Voss sat in a federal holding cell and waited for a lawyer who would tell him what he already knew, that the nurse nobody noticed had just burned his empire to the foundation. Mara's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. An unknown number. She answered. "You think this ends with Wolf and Voss?" The voice was male, calm, and utterly without effect, the vocal equivalent of a blank wall. Kestrel was one operation. There are 14 others, and the people who authorized them are not in any file your federal friends have found. The line went dead. Mara stared at the phone. The screen faded to black, reflecting her face back at her, pale, drawn, eyes dark with exhaustion, and something else. Something that had been building since she'd walked back into Ridgemont Memorial and hadn't stopped since. 14 operations. She set the phone down on the table beside the Admiral's bed and looked at Okafor, who was already reading the expression on her face. "What?" Okafor said. Mara picked up the Kestrel file. 347 pages. 4 years of buried truth. 11 names she carried like stones. And now 14 more operations she'd never heard of. She turned to the first page and started reading again from the beginning. She read through the night and into the morning, and what she found in those 347 pages changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. The Kestrel files weren't just a record of one operation. They were a ledger. Buried in the appendices, in the footnotes that nobody was supposed to cross-reference, were procurement codes, alphanumeric designations for chemical compounds ordered through Valcorp's classified supply chain. 14 distinct codes, 14 distinct compounds. Each one linked to a field testing authorization signed by someone whose name had been redacted with such heavy black ink that the paper itself was warped. But the procurement codes weren't redacted. Whoever had sanitized the files had scrubbed names and locations, but left the logistics intact. The kind of mistake that happens when bureaucrats are in a hurry, when the cover-up has a deadline, and the person doing the redacting doesn't understand what the numbers mean. Mara understood what the numbers meant. She'd spent 14 months at Ridgemont Memorial watching medication codes scroll across dispensing screens. She'd memorized formulary designations the way other people memorize phone numbers, automatically, compulsively, because her brain was wired to notice patterns in strings of data that everyone else treated as background noise. 3 of the 14 procurement codes matched compounds that had passed through Ridgemont's pharmacy system. She recognized them because she'd flagged them and been told to stay in her lane, flagged them and been written up for overstepping, flagged them and been slowly, systematically pushed to the margins until she was invisible enough to ignore and small enough to fire. She pulled up the tablet's search function and cross-referenced the 3 codes against the medication substitution memos that agents had recovered from Linda Voss's shredder. The matches were exact. Ridgemont Memorial wasn't the only testing site, but it was the one Mara could prove. At 6:14 a.m., she walked into the hallway outside Beckett's room and found Okafor asleep in a chair, her head tilted at an angle that was going to cost her neck for days. Mara touched her shoulder. Okafor woke instantly, the way people who work in crisis wake, without confusion, without the slow climb from sleep to consciousness that civilians take for granted. "I found something," Mara said. She laid it out in the secured conference room that the hospital had designated for the investigation. Okafor, Reeves, and 2 DoD analysts named Park and Whitfield sat across the table while Mara walked them through the procurement codes, the cross-references, the pattern that connected Kestrel to Ridgemont, to at least 11 other locations she couldn't yet identify. "The redactions removed human identifiers," Mara said, pointing to the tablet screen projected on the wall. "But the logistics chain is intact. Every compound Valcorp tested required a procurement authorization, a shipping manifest, and a receiving confirmation. Those documents exist somewhere, either in Valcorp's servers, which you seized yesterday, or in the Defense Logistics Agency's archive." Park, the senior analyst, was already typing. "DLA records are archived on a 7-year cycle. If the authorizations were processed through standard channels, they'll be in the system." "They weren't standard," Okafor said. "These were classified procurements, different database, different access protocols. But the same shipping infrastructure," Mara said. "You can classify the authorization, but you can't classify a FedEx truck. The compounds had to move physically from Valcorp's manufacturing facilities to the testing sites. That means shipping records, customs declarations for international sites, and receiving logs at every destination." Whitfield looked up from his laptop. "She's right. The logistics footprint can't be fully classified because it intersects with civilian transportation networks. We can subpoena the carriers." Okafor stood and paced the length of the conference room. She was doing the calculation that investigators do when a case suddenly expands beyond its original scope, weighing the opportunity against the risk, the resources against the timeline, the political implications against the legal ones. "If we pursue all 14 operations," she said, "this becomes the largest military contractor prosecution in U.S. history. We're talking about multiple theaters, multiple compounds, potentially hundreds of victims, military and civilian." "Yes," Mara said. "The political exposure alone, 2 senators, a former deputy secretary of defense, the CEO of a major contractor. This goes to the highest levels of the appropriations and oversight apparatus." "Yes, and the phone call you received last night. Someone knows we're pulling the thread. Someone with access to information about our investigation." Mara nodded. She'd replayed the call in her head a dozen times. The voice, flat, effectless, deliberately anonymized. The content, specific enough to be credible, vague enough to be deniable. And the implication that whatever Okafor's team had uncovered was only the surface, and that the people beneath it were still untouched. "We need to move faster," Mara said. "Whoever called me knows the timeline. They know about the Senate hearing. If we wait for the hearing to build the case, they'll have time to destroy whatever the Valcorp servers haven't already given us." "What are you suggesting?" "Beckett. He's improving. His creatinine dropped to 3.1 overnight, and his rhythm has been stable sinus for the last 4 hours. He's going to be conscious and coherent within 24 hours. When he wakes up, he'll have information that isn't in any file, operational details he carried in his head because he didn't trust the classification system to protect them. You want to debrief him before the hearing. I want to give him the chance to tell someone what he knows before whoever made that phone call decides to try again." Okafor stopped pacing. She looked at Mara with an expression that had evolved significantly over the past 18 hours, from professional assessment to grudging respect to something that now looked like partnership. "Okay," she said. "We debrief Beckett as soon as he's medically cleared. In the meantime, I'm requesting expanded warrants for the DLA archives and Valcorp's offshore subsidiaries. Park, Whitfield, start mapping the logistics chain for all 14 procurement codes. I want shipping routes, dates, and destination facilities by end of day." The analysts moved. Reeves moved. The room shifted into the controlled urgency of an investigation that had just found its spine. Mara stayed at the table after the others left. She was staring at the projected image on the wall, the organizational chart from the Kestrel file, with its web of connections radiating outward from Valcorp like cracks in broken glass. Somewhere in that web was the person who'd called her, someone who knew about the 14 operations, someone who wasn't in the files, someone who sat above the redaction line, in the space where names didn't appear because the people who held them were powerful enough to erase themselves. She picked up the tablet and began building a new chart. Not the one in the file, her own. Starting with what she knew. Wolf, Ashworth, Linda Voss, Harrison Voss, Senators Hale and Pruitt, the unnamed deputy secretary. Then what she suspected. The caller, the network that supported the kill team, the infrastructure that could maintain 14 covert testing operations across multiple countries without detection. The chart grew. By the time she stopped, it covered 3 screens and had a hole in the center, a blank space where the architect of the entire system should have been. She stared at the blank space and thought, "I'll find you." Beckett woke at 4:17 p.m. the following day. Not the half-conscious, drugged flutter of his eyes on the transport plane. A real waking, with recognition and orientation and the immediate urgent alertness of a military officer who understood that consciousness was a resource not to be wasted. Mara was in the room. She'd barely left it in 36 hours, sleeping in 2-hour shifts in the chair beside his bed, waking every time the monitor changed pitch or the IV pump beeped its completion alarm. Ibarra had tried twice to convince her to use the staff room. Mara had declined with a politeness that left no room for further discussion. Beckett's eyes opened and found her face. This time there was clarity in them, gray and sharp and fully present. "Who are you?" His voice was a wreck. Intubation, dehydration, and 48 hours of unconsciousness had reduced it to a raw whisper. "Mara Sinclair. I was a nurse at the hospital where you were admitted. I'm also a former combat medic, 47th Forward Medical Support Team." Something changed in his face, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in the muscles of his jaw. Recognition, not of her, but of the unit designation. "Kestrel," he said. "Yes, sir." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I was told there were no survivors." There was one. He looked at her for a long time. The cardiac monitor marked the silence in steady beats. 72 per minute now, sinus rhythm, strong and regular. The heart of a man who had been dead 24 hours ago. "I ordered the investigation," he said. "Your unit filed the reports, chemical anomalies in the casualty blood work. I read them personally. I authorized a full inquiry through the Inspector General's office." He paused. "The inquiry was shut down in 48 hours, classification override. I was reassigned to a desk position in Norfolk and told that the matter had been resolved through diplomatic channels." It hadn't. "No, it had been buried. And then your people started dying and I—" His voice failed. He swallowed, tried again. "I should have fought harder. You tried to fight it all. That's more than anyone else in the chain did. It wasn't enough." "No," Mara said, "it wasn't." She didn't soften it. She didn't offer comfort or absolution or any of the gentle words that people use to cushion a man from the weight of his own failures. Beckett had failed. He'd tried, and he'd been stopped, and 11 people had died. That was the truth, and Mara had spent 4 years suffocating under lies, and she was done carrying anyone else's comfort along with her own grief. But she also didn't walk away. She pulled the chair closer to his bedside and sat down. "The Senate hearing is in 5 days," she said. "They want both of us. Your testimony covers the command chain. Mine covers what happened on the ground. What do you need from me? Everything you remember, every name, every order, every conversation. The files are heavily redacted, the logistics data is intact, but the human intelligence, who said what to whom, who gave the authorization, who made the calls, that's in your head. And someone is willing to kill to keep it there." Beckett's eyes hardened. The Admiral was back. The flag officer who'd commanded naval forces across an entire theater, who'd sent men and women into combat and lived with the consequences. The patient faded. The commander surfaced. "Get me something to write on," he said. Mara handed him the tablet and a stylus. Over the next 3 hours, Beckett dictated everything he remembered. Names that weren't in the files. Meetings that weren't on any calendar. Phone calls that had been deliberately excluded from official logs. The architecture of a conspiracy that reached from a chemical manufacturing facility in suburban Virginia to a forward operating base in a desert to the office of a Deputy Secretary of Defense, who had since retired to a seven-figure consulting role at the company whose products had killed Mara's friends. The Deputy Secretary's name was Gerald Fisk. Fisk signed the executive memorandum authorizing Blackridge, Beckett said. Not the president, Fisk. He had delegated authority for classified special access programs, and he used it to authorize field testing without congressional notification. The legal framework was a footnote in a defense appropriations rider. 3 sentences buried in a 2,000-page spending bill that nobody read. 3 sentences, Mara repeated. That's all it took. 3 sentences gave Valcorp the legal cover to test weaponized compounds on civilian populations in active conflict zones, using U.S. military medical units as unwitting quality control. Beckett's hand tightened on the stylus. When your unit flagged the chemical anomalies, Fisk panicked. He called Voss directly. I know this because I was copied on a communication intercept that was later reclassified above my clearance level. The intercept showed Fisk and Voss discussing containment options. 22 days later, your unit was dead. Mara's chest ached. Not her heart, her ribs, the muscles between them, the physical structures that held her together. She breathed through it the way she breathed through everything. Controlled, measured, one inhale at a time. Fisk is retired, she said. Can you tie him directly to the authorization for the poisoning? The intercept does, if it still exists. Where would it be? NSA archives. Signals intelligence classified at the TS/SCI level. The original was routed through the National Security Council's crisis coordination system. There will be a digital footprint. Those systems don't delete, they archive. Mara stood and went to the door. Okafor was in the hallway as if she'd been waiting. She had. She'd been listening through the room's intercom system, with Beckett's knowledge and consent. The Admiral had agreed to have his debrief monitored and recorded as part of the evidentiary chain. Gerald Fisk, Mara said. I heard. Okafor's face was grim. Fisk is connected, deeply connected. He sits on the advisory boards of 3 defense think tanks, 2 of which provide briefing materials to the current National Security Council. Charging him requires ironclad evidence. The NSA intercept. I'll file the request. But TS/SCI material requires a special declassification review before it can be used in legal proceedings. That process normally takes months. We have 5 days. I know. Okafor exhaled. I'll call the director's office. While Okafor worked the bureaucracy, the case unfolded on other fronts. The Valcorp server seizure yielded more than anyone had expected, not because Voss had been careless, but because the volume of the conspiracy made total sanitization impossible. 11 years of operations across 14 programs generated a data footprint that no amount of encryption and deletion could fully erase. Park and Whitfield, working with a team of forensic analysts at DoD headquarters, began mapping the 14 operations within 48 hours of the warrant execution. The picture that emerged was staggering. Valcorp had conducted unauthorized chemical testing in 6 countries across 3 continents. The test subjects included foreign military personnel, civilian populations in conflict zones, and in 3 confirmed cases, U.S. service members who'd been exposed without knowledge or consent. The total estimated casualty count, combining known fatalities and projected long-term health effects, exceeded 400 people. The number hit Mara like a physical weight. She'd been carrying 11 names, 11 faces, 11 stories, 11 lives that she'd memorized and mourned and kept alive in the only place they still existed, her memory. And now the number was 400. 400 people who'd been used as data points in a profit calculation. She sat with that number in the staff room at Walter Reed, in the narrow bed that she still hadn't properly slept in, and she felt the scale of it settle onto her shoulders. Not just the grief, the responsibility. She was the thread that connected all of it. The witness, the survivor, the woman who'd been in the room when Wolf pushed the syringe, who'd recognized the compound, who'd saved the Admiral, who'd pulled the first thread that was now unraveling the entire machine. If she hadn't been standing in Trauma Bay 1 at Ridgemont Memorial that night, if she'd been on a different floor or a different shift, or if they'd managed to fire her an hour earlier, Beckett would be dead, the testimony would be silenced, and 400 casualties would remain a rounding error in Valcorp's quarterly reports. The thought made her nauseous, not because of what had happened, but because of how close it had come to not happening. The margin between justice and erasure had been one woman in the wrong place at the right time, doing a job that nobody valued, noticing something that nobody else saw. On the third day before the hearing, Gerald Fisk's name appeared in the news. Not in connection with the investigation. The case was still sealed under federal classification. Fisk appeared at a defense industry conference in Washington, D.C., delivering a keynote address on ethical innovation in national security. The irony was so precise it felt engineered. Mara watched the live stream on the tablet in Beckett's room. Fisk was 63, silver-haired, and possessed of the easy confidence of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where his word was policy. He spoke about accountability, about the sacred trust between defense contractors and the military personnel who relied on their products. He received a standing ovation. Beckett watched from his bed. His color had improved dramatically. 2 rounds of dialysis had cleared the metabolites, and his kidney function was recovering faster than Ibarra had projected. He could sit up now, eat solid food, and maintain conversations for hours without tiring. The Admiral was coming back. "He doesn't know," Beckett said, watching Fisk on the screen. "Doesn't know what?" "That we have the intercept." Mara turned. "Okafor got the declassification?" "Expedited review. The NSA director approved it personally after the DOJ filed a national security exception." Beckett's voice carried something new, something that hadn't been there during the debrief. Anticipation. "The intercept is authenticated, time-stamped, and admissible. It records a 23-minute phone conversation between Gerald Fisk and Harrison Voss, 17 days before the Kestrel poisoning. They discuss your unit by designation. They discuss the chemical anomalies your medics reported. And they discuss, their word, neutralization of the reporting chain. Bas omapashesenta. They used that word? Neutralization? Fisk used it. Voss pushed back, suggested reassignment, transfer, administrative solutions. Fisk overruled him. He said reassignment left residual exposure and that the only viable option was permanent neutralization with plausible attribution. Permanent neutralization with plausible attribution. 11 people reduced to a risk management calculation. "When does the hearing start?" Mara asked. "Tuesday, 9 a.m., closed session, Hart Senate Office Building, room 216. "And Fisk?" "Has not been notified. He's not a witness. He's a subject. Okafor's team will serve the arrest warrant after the hearing concludes, once the testimony is part of the congressional record and can't be suppressed." "What if he runs before then?" "He won't run. He doesn't believe he's vulnerable. Men like Fisk never do. They've operated above accountability for so long that the concept becomes theoretical." Beckett looked at her. "That's their weakness. They can't imagine that the system they built to protect themselves would ever be used against them." Mara thought about Ridgemont, about Dr. Ellison telling her to stay in her lane, about Ashworth sliding the termination document across the desk, about 14 months of being told that she was the problem, that her instincts were wrong, that the system was functioning as designed. The system had been functioning as designed, just not the design she'd been told about. "Admiral," she said, "the phone call I received, the one warning about 14 operations. Okafor's team traced the prepaid number to a dead end, purchased with cash in Baltimore, activated once, destroyed. But whoever made that call had information that only someone inside the network would have. You think it was someone trying to help? I think it was someone trying to survive. If the network collapses, the people at the lower levels go down first. Someone below Fisk knows what's coming and is looking for a way out." Beckett considered this. "Or someone above Fisk is cutting loose ends and warning you was part of a larger play." "Above Fisk?" Gerald Fisk authorized Blackridge, but Blackridge was one program out of 14. Someone authorized the architecture that made all 14 possible. The funding channels, the classification protocols, the legal frameworks. Fisk didn't build that architecture. He used it. The blank space in Mara's organizational chart. The hole in the center of the web. "Who built it?" she asked. Beckett was quiet for a long time. The monitor beeped. Outside, a helicopter passed over the building. Military, probably a medevac run. The sound so familiar to both of them that neither looked up. I don't know, he said finally, but I know where to look. During my time as regional commander, I had access to the Joint Special Operations Archive, operational blueprints for classified programs dating back 15 years. The archive includes the authorization chain for every special access program conducted in my area of responsibility. If the architecture for Black Ridge was built on a pre-existing framework, the blueprint will be there. And you can access it? I can request access. Whether it's granted depends on how far up this investigation reaches and how frightened the people at the top are. He paused. But there's another way. What way? The person who called you. If they're inside the network, if they have access to the operations Okafor hasn't uncovered yet, they're the fastest path to the architect. They've already made contact once. They'll do it again. You want me to wait for a phone call? I want you to be ready when it comes. Because whoever called you didn't do it out of altruism. They did it because they need something. And when they call back to tell you what that is, you'll have leverage you don't have right now. Mara looked at the phone on the bedside table. The unknown number. The flat, anonymous voice. 14 operations. The phone sat there, dark and silent, holding its secrets the way this entire system held its secrets. Behind layers of classification and redaction and institutional silence, waiting for someone stubborn enough to keep digging. She picked it up and put it in her pocket. 2 days before the hearing, the phone rang. She was in the staff room, 3 a.m., unable to sleep. The phone vibrated against the desk surface with a sound like a small animal scratching at a door. Unknown number. Different from the first. This one had a Virginia area code. She answered. You've been reading the files, the voice said. Same flat effect, same deliberate anonymity. But something underneath, a tension that hadn't been there before. Urgency, maybe. Or fear. Yes, Mara said. Then you know Fisk is the wall. Everything behind him stays hidden as long as he controls the narrative. The hearing will expose him, but it won't expose what's behind him. Who's behind him? Silence. The kind that means someone is deciding how much to risk. There's a server. Not at Valcorp. Voss was too smart to keep everything in one place. The server is at a private data facility in McLean, Virginia, leased under a shell company called Meridian Strategic Partners. The lease is paid through a trust administered by a law firm in Zurich. The trust beneficiary is listed as a foundation, the Kepler Initiative for Defense Research. Mara was writing on the back of a medication information sheet, the only paper within reach. And who controls the Kepler Initiative? That's what the server will tell you. The authorization chain for all 14 operations is on that server, unredacted. Names, dates, signatures. Everything Fisk hid, everything Voss encrypted, everything the Senate doesn't know yet. Why are you telling me this? Another silence. Longer. Because I was at Firebase Osprey, the voice said. 18 months before Kestrel. Same compound, different unit, 23 casualties. I survived because I was on leave when they contaminated the water supply. Mara stopped writing. Her hand was frozen over the paper. Nobody investigated Osprey, the voice continued. Nobody even knew it happened. The casualties were attributed to a waterborne pathogen, dysentery outbreak, field sanitation failure. 23 death certificates, all signed by a military physician who was transferred to a Valcorp research facility 6 weeks later. Who are you? Someone who's been carrying names the same way you have. For longer. A pause. The server in McLean. Get your federal people there before the hearing. If Fisk finds out the intercept has been declassified, his first call will be to Meridian to wipe that server. And if that data disappears, the architect disappears with it. The line went dead. Mara was already moving. She hit Okafor's number, a direct line that the agent had given her with explicit instructions to use it only in emergencies. Okafor answered on the second ring. Meridian Strategic Partners, Mara said. Data facility in McLean. I need you to get a warrant and a seizure team there before sunrise. She heard Okafor sit up in bed. Heard the rustle of sheets, the click of a lamp. Tell me everything, Mara told her. The Kepler Initiative. The trust in Zurich. The unredacted authorization chain. Firebase Osprey. Osprey, Okafor repeated. We don't have Osprey in our files. Because no one investigated it. 23 casualties attributed to dysentery, 18 months before Kestrel, same compound. The caller is a survivor. Yes. Okafor was quiet for 5 seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality of someone who has just realized that the case they've been building for 2 years is actually 10 times larger than they thought, and that sleep is no longer a concept that applies to their life. I'll have a team at McLean by 0500. Federal magistrate owes me a favor. I'll get an emergency warrant by phone. If the caller is right about Fisk monitoring the declassification, then we're in a race. I know. A pause. Mara, this caller, do you trust them? Mara thought about it. Not the quick, reflexive assessment of credibility that she'd been trained to perform. A real gut-level evaluation of a voice on a phone that had given her information she couldn't verify, from a person she'd never met, who claimed to share the one thing she'd thought was hers alone. The burden of being the only one left. I trust that they're carrying dead people the same way I am, she said. That's enough. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be long. Mara hung up. She stood in the dark staff room and listened to the building breathe. The ventilation hum. The distant elevator chime. The muffled footsteps of night shift nurses in the corridor. Walter Reed at 3 a.m. was not so different from Ridgemont Memorial at 3 a.m. The same sounds, the same smells, the same quiet machinery of an institution that never fully sleeps. But everything else was different. At Ridgemont, she'd been invisible. Here, she was the center of gravity, the witness around whom an entire federal investigation had organized itself, the person whose testimony could bring down senators and contractors and a retired Deputy Secretary of Defense who was currently sleeping in his Georgetown townhouse with no idea that a data facility 12 miles away was about to be raided by federal agents with a warrant bearing his name. She didn't sleep. She went back to Beckett's room and sat in the chair beside his bed and watched the monitor trace its steady, reliable rhythm. The heart she'd saved, the testimony that would follow. At 5:23 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from Okafor. 4 words. McLean server secured. And below it, a second message. You were right. The names go higher than Fisk, much higher. We need to talk. In person. Now. Mara stood, put the phone in her pocket, and walked out of the room. The hallway was still dark, the building still quiet, the Marines still standing at their posts. She moved through the corridor with the walk of someone who had been invisible for a very long time and had finally learned that visibility wasn't something you were given. It was something you took. The secured conference room at Walter Reed looked different at 6 in the morning. The overhead lights were too bright, the coffee was too bitter, and the faces around the table carried the specific exhaustion of people who'd been awake for 30 straight hours, because the alternative was letting something terrible slip through their fingers. Okafor stood at the head of the table with a laptop open in front of her. Park and Whitfield flanked her on either side. Reeves was by the door. And in the center of the screen, projected large enough that every person in the room could read it clearly, was a name that Mara had never seen before, but that rewrote everything she thought she understood about the architecture of what had happened to her unit. Deputy National Security Advisor Evelyn Hargrove. Hargrove authorized the framework, Okafor said. Her voice was flat in the way that happens when you're delivering information so explosive that emotion would destabilize it. Not just Blackridge, the entire classified testing infrastructure, all 14 operations, the funding channels, the legal justifications, the interagency protocols that allowed Valcorp to operate across multiple theaters without oversight. Mara stared at the name. At the photograph beside it, a woman in her late 50s, sharp-featured, with the kind of face that cameras loved and opponents learned to fear. Hargrove had been deputy NSA for 6 years. Before that, she'd served in 3 administrations in various national security roles. She was on the short list for cabinet positions. She testified before Congress twice a year. She was, by every public measure, one of the most trusted voices in American defense policy. The server in McLean had the unredacted authorization chain, Okafor continued. Every operation, every compound, every testing site. Hargrove signed off on all of it. Fisk executed, Voss profited, but Hargrove designed the system that made it possible. She's still in office, Mara said. As of 40 minutes ago, yes. That changes at 0800 when the Attorney General personally delivers the criminal referral to the White House. Park pulled up another document on the shared screen. The Kepler Initiative, the foundation that controlled the McLean server, was established by Hargrove in 2014, 2 years before Blackridge began. The stated purpose was advancing ethical frameworks for emerging defense technologies. The actual purpose was laundering authorization documents through a private entity that couldn't be subpoenaed through normal congressional channels. How much money moved through Kepler? Mara asked. $4.7 billion over 11 years. Dispersed to Valcorp and 6 other defense contractors for projects that don't appear in any official budget. The entire operation was funded through classified appropriations that Hargrove personally managed. Mara thought about the 3 sentences in the appropriations rider, about the legal framework that Beckett had described, a footnote in a spending bill that nobody read. Hargrove had written that footnote. She'd buried it in 2,000 pages of bureaucratic language, and then she'd used it to authorize experiments on human beings across 3 continents. Firebase Osprey, Mara said. The caller mentioned it. Where is it in this? Whitfield brought up a spreadsheet. Osprey was the second operation, 18 months before Kestrel. Different compound. TX-27, a neurotoxin designed for area denial. 23 casualties, all military personnel. Official cause of death was listed as bacterial dysentery from contaminated water. No investigation, no autopsy, no congressional notification. Because Hargrove classified it immediately, Okafor said. Under the national security exemption she'd built into the framework. The commanding officer who questioned the official story was reassigned to a desk position in Alaska. The medical examiner who signed the death certificates received a research grant from Valcorp 6 weeks later, $2.3 million for a study on field sanitation protocols that was never completed. Mara's hands were flat on the table. She pressed down, feeling the solid surface, grounding herself in something physical, because the scale of what she was hearing threatened to pull her into a place where nothing was solid. How many operations have we confirmed casualties for? She asked. 8 of the 14. Total documented fatalities, 417. Projected long-term health effects for exposed individuals who survived the initial exposure, another 263. 680 people. Mara had been carrying 11. She'd thought that was the weight she had to bear. 11 names, 11 faces, 11 lives that she kept alive in her memory because nobody else would. And now the number was 680, and the woman responsible was sitting in an office in the West Wing with a security clearance that gave her access to every classified program in the U.S. government. The hearing, Mara said. Does the committee know about Hargrove? Not yet. The plan was to build the case against Fisk and Voss first, then use their testimony to reach Hargrove. But the McLean server accelerates the timeline. Okafor closed the laptop. We can't wait for the hearing. If Hargrove learns that the server has been seized, if she has time to coordinate with her legal team or reach out to allies in the administration, she'll bury this so deep that we'll spend the next 5 years fighting classification reviews. What are you proposing? We move now. The Attorney General serves the referral at 0800. Arrest warrants for Hargrove, Fisk, Voss, and 11 other individuals connected to the operations execute simultaneously. And we do it before the hearing so that when you and Beckett testify, you're testifying about defendants in federal custody, not subjects of an ongoing investigation. Mara looked around this table, at faces that were tired and determined and carrying the weight of a case that had started as a poisoned admiral and had grown into something that would define careers and rewrite the institutional memory of how far people in power were willing to go when nobody was watching. What do you need from me? She asked. Your testimony, Okafor said. Not the prepared statement you've been working on with Beckett. I need you to walk into that hearing room and tell them everything. The names, the deaths, the cover-up, the 14 operations, the 680 casualties. I need you to make it real for them. Not a number in a briefing document, but human beings who trusted the system to protect them and were murdered by it instead. And Hargrove? Will be in custody when you testify. So will Fisk and Voss. The committee will see the arrest reports before the hearing starts. They'll know that this isn't theoretical, that the people responsible are already facing charges. Mara stood. The chair scraped against the floor, too loud in the small room. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, at the gray morning light that was starting to push through the clouds. Somewhere in the building, Admiral Beckett was waking up. Somewhere in Georgetown, Gerald Fisk was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper and had no idea that his life was about to end. Somewhere in the West Wing, Evelyn Hargrove was preparing for another day of shaping national security policy with the blood of 680 people on her hands. I'll testify, Mara said, but I want one thing. Name it. When Hargrove is arrested, I want to be there. I want to see her face when she realizes that the system she built to protect herself is the same system that's taking her down. Okafor looked at her for a long moment, then she nodded. I'll make it happen. They arrested Evelyn Hargrove at 8:14 a.m. in her West Wing office, 14 minutes after the Attorney General delivered the criminal referral to the Chief of Staff. Mara watched it happen from a federal SUV parked on West Executive Avenue, the same street where presidents walked to the Oval Office and where power was supposed to mean something. Okafor was beside her. Through the vehicle's tinted windows, they had a clear view of the entrance where Hargrove would emerge. The Deputy National Security Advisor walked out flanked by 2 FBI agents. She was in handcuffs, not the discreet behind-the-back positioning that celebrities get when they're arrested for white-collar crimes, but visible, wrists crossed in front, the metal bright against the dark fabric of her suit. She looked smaller than she did on television, older. And when her eyes swept the street, an automatic scan, the habit of someone who'd spent decades assessing threats. They landed on the SUV where Mara sat. Their eyes met through the tinted glass. Hargrove couldn't see Mara clearly. The windows were too dark, the distance too great. But she looked anyway, and for a moment her face registered something that might have been recognition or might have been the first edge of fear. Then the agents guided her into a waiting vehicle, and the door closed, and Evelyn Hargrove was gone. Mara exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. "How do you feel?" Okafor asked. "I don't know yet. That's normal." They sat in silence as the federal convoy pulled away. Then Okafor's phone rang. She answered, listened, and hung up. "Fisk and Voss are in custody. So are 9 of the other defendants. 2 are abroad. We're coordinating extradition through state. The Senate committee has been notified. The hearing starts in 90 minutes. Mara looked at her reflection in the window. The woman looking back was pale, exhausted, and wearing a borrowed blazer over clean scrubs because nobody had thought to bring her civilian clothes when they'd evacuated her from Ridgemont Memorial 4 days ago. She looked like someone who'd been through something. She looked like someone who'd survived. She also looked like someone who wasn't done yet. "Let's go," she said. The Hart Senate office building was designed to project power. Marble columns, vaulted ceilings, hallways wide enough to march armies through. Room 216 was smaller than Mara expected, more functional than grand, with a long table for the committee members and a single witness chair facing them like a defendant in a trial. Mara sat in that chair at 10:03 a.m. and looked at the 7 senators who would decide what happened next. She recognized 2 of them from the investigation, the ones who'd been conspicuously absent from any of Okafor's briefings because they were subjects of the inquiry themselves. Senator Richard Hale sat 3 seats from the left, his face carefully neutral. Senator Diane Pruitt was at the far right, and she wouldn't meet Mara's eyes. The committee chairman, a man named Vickers, gray-haired and careful, representing a state Mara had never visited, opened the session with a statement about the seriousness of the allegations and the committee's commitment to uncovering the truth. Then he looked directly at Mara. "Ms. Sinclair, you've been sworn. The floor is yours." She'd prepared a statement. 3 pages, carefully written with Beckett's help, covering the timeline of events from Kestrel to Ridgemont to the arrest that morning. It was organized, professional, and entirely inadequate to the task of making 680 deaths mean something to people who dealt in numbers larger than that every day. She set the statement aside. 4 years ago, she said, I was a combat medic stationed at Firebase Kestrel. My job was to keep people alive. I was good at it. I'd been trained at Fort Bragg, deployed twice, and I'd treated casualties from explosives, gunfire, vehicle accidents, heat stroke, infectious disease, and every other way that human bodies fail in a combat zone. I thought I'd seen everything. She paused. Nobody interrupted. On the night of August 14th, my entire unit started dying. Not from enemy fire, not from an attack, from a compound in our water supply, a military-grade toxin that had been deliberately introduced by people who were supposed to be on our side. I watched 11 people die in under 2 hours. I tried to save them. I failed. The only reason I survived was because a pharmacologist named Dr. Alan Ostrowski used the last dose of the counteragent on me instead of on himself. He saved my life, and then he died. And I didn't know for 4 years that he'd made that choice. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced this part, not the words, but the steadiness. The ability to say it out loud without breaking. The official story was that we were killed in a mortar attack. There was no investigation. The bodies were sealed and shipped home and buried with honors. And I was told that I had survivor's guilt, that I was traumatized, that what I remembered wasn't reliable because trauma distorts memory. For 4 years, I believed that maybe they were right, that maybe I'd imagined the things I saw, that maybe I was the problem. She looked at Senator Hale. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. I wasn't the problem. The problem was a system that authorized the murder of 680 people, military and civilian, American and foreign, to generate test data for chemical weapons that were then sold to the highest bidder. The problem was a deputy national security advisor who built a legal framework to make that murder possible. The problem was contractors who profited from it, senators who protected it, and institutions that classified it so thoroughly that the people who died were erased from every record except the ones their families keep. Senator Pruitt shifted in her chair. The movement was small, uncomfortable, the body language of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. Yesterday morning, Mara continued, federal agents arrested Deputy National Security Advisor Evelyn Hargrove, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Gerald Fisk, Valcorp, CEO Harrison Voss, and 9 other individuals connected to these operations. The arrests were based on evidence recovered from servers, financial records, and communications that document 11 years of unauthorized human testing conducted under the legal cover of classified national security programs. She pulled out a piece of paper from her jacket pocket. It was folded, worn at the creases from being carried for days. She unfolded it carefully and set it on the table in front of her. These are the names of the 11 people who died at Firebase Kestrel. I've carried this list for 4 years. I say these names every night before I sleep, because if I don't say them, nobody will. They're not in any official memorial. They're not on any casualty list. They don't exist in the record because the system that killed them also erased them. She began to read. Sergeant Danny Flores, Sergeant Keiko Watanabe, Corporal Marcus Ridley, Specialist Jennifer Holcomb, Private First Class Aaron DeSanto, Staff Sergeant Terrence Blake, Specialist Michaela Sung, Corporal David Oakes, Private First Class Yasmin Tariq, Specialist Robert Kellerman, Dr. Alan Ostrowski. Her voice caught on the last name, not because she was breaking, because saying it out loud in this room, in front of these people, with the weight of federal authority behind it, made it real in a way it hadn't been when she was alone. These people are why I'm here, she said, not for revenge, not for closure, but because the system that killed them is still operating, and the people who built it are still in positions where they can do it again. And I will not let their deaths be turned into a classification level and a redaction and a convenient story about combat casualties. Chairman Vickers leaned forward. Ms. Sinclair, the committee has reviewed the evidence provided by the Department of Justice. The scope of what you've described is, he paused, searching for a word, unprecedented. These hearings will continue for weeks, possibly months. We will need your continued cooperation. You have it. The individuals who were arrested this morning will face criminal prosecution, but the institutional failures that allowed this to happen, the oversight gaps, the classification abuses, the interagency coordination failures, those require legislative solutions. This committee will be drafting reforms. Mara looked at him. At his careful face, his careful words, his careful promise of reforms that would be drafted and debated and amended and eventually passed in some form that made everyone feel like they'd done something. Reforms are necessary, she said, but they're not sufficient. The people who died didn't die because of oversight gaps. They died because people in power made a choice to value profit and secrecy over human life. You can't reform that. You can only hold people accountable for it. And we will, Vickers said. Good, because I'll be watching. The hearing continued for another 6 hours. Beckett testified after Mara, walking the committee through the command chain, the authorization process, and the communications intercept that tied Fisk directly to the Kestrel murders. Then came the forensic analysts, the DoD investigators, the financial experts who explained how $4.7 billion had moved through a foundation that existed on paper but had no physical presence anywhere in the world. By the time the session adjourned at 8:47 p.m., 2 senators had announced their resignation, Hale and Pruitt. The announcements came within minutes of each other, released through their offices with nearly identical language about stepping aside to avoid any appearance of impropriety, and allowing the investigation to proceed without distraction. Nobody was fooled. They were running before the evidence caught up with them. It would, anyway. The financial records didn't lie, and the committee had access to all of them now. But the resignations bought them time and the thin veneer of having left on their own terms. Mara watched the news coverage from the staff room at Walter Reed. Beckett was beside her, sitting in a wheelchair, because Ibarra had insisted, even though he could walk now, and had done so for 20 minutes straight that afternoon just to prove it. "They'll get away with parts of it," Beckett said. "That's how it works. The system protects itself even when it's dismantling one of its own components." "Parts of it," Mara agreed. "But not all of it. Hargrove is going to prison. So is Fisk. So is Voss. And every person who worked for them, everyone who signed a document or moved money or authorized a test, they're all exposed now. Some of them will cut deals, some of them will flip, but none of them walk away clean." "Is that enough for you?" She thought about this, about what enough meant. She'd spent 4 years carrying 11 names and believing that she was alone in carrying them. Now she knew about Osprey, about the 23 people who'd died there, about the survivor who'd called her from an unknown number and trusted her with information that had broken the case wide open. She knew about the other operations, 12 more that Okafor's team was still mapping, 12 more collections of names that someone, somewhere, was carrying the same way she'd carried hers. "It's a start," she said. 3 weeks later, Mara stood in Arlington National Cemetery under a sky that threatened rain but hadn't delivered yet. The headstones were new, 12 of them, 11 for the members of her unit, 1 for Dr. Alan Ostrowski. The military had finally, officially, acknowledged what had happened at Kestrel, not in the sanitized language of the original cover story, but in clear terms: murdered by a chemical weapon deployed by U.S. defense contractors under a classified testing program. Each headstone carried the service member's name, rank, dates of service, and a new designation that the DoD had created specifically for this circumstance: killed in the line of duty by wrongful government action. It wasn't enough. No designation could be. But it was something. It was the truth, carved in stone, placed in ground that the government maintained and that families could visit, and that would exist long after everyone involved in the cover-up was dead. Mara knelt in front of Danny Flores' headstone. She'd brought something, a photograph that Danny's daughter Sophie had sent her after the hearing. It showed Sophie at 7 years old, holding a sign that read, "My dad was a hero." Mara had framed it. She set it against the base of the headstone, wedged between the grass and the marble, where it would stay until weather took it or someone decided it didn't belong. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, careful, the gait of someone who was still recovering from having been poisoned and then brought back from the edge by a woman who'd refused to let the system win again. Admiral Beckett stood beside her. He wasn't in a wheelchair anymore. He was in full dress uniform, the first time he'd worn it since the hearing, since his testimony had ended a deputy secretary's freedom and started a chain reaction that was still toppling powerful people like dominoes arranged by someone with a grudge and a steady hand. "The Senate voted this morning," he said. "Unanimous approval for the Kestrel Accountability Act. It creates an independent oversight body for all classified human testing programs, requires annual congressional notification, establishes criminal penalties for unauthorized testing, and it allocates funds for a victim compensation program." "How much?" $200 million over 5 years, for medical monitoring, long-term care, and financial support for families of the deceased. Mara stood. "That's not enough to cover 680 casualties." "No, but it's what they could get past. And it's expandable. The legislation includes a provision for additional funding if more operations are uncovered." She looked at the headstones. 12 names. 11 she'd carried for 4 years. 1 she'd only recently learned had made the choice that allowed her to be standing here. "Have you heard from the Osprey survivor?" Beckett asked. "No. They called once more, 2 days after the arrest, just to confirm that the McLean server had been secured. I tried to trace the number, so did Okafor's team, but it was another burner, activated once and destroyed. They're still out there, still carrying their names." "Yes." "Are you going to try to find them?" Mara thought about this, about what it would mean to find someone who'd survived the same thing she had, who'd made the same choice to keep going when the easy option was to believe the system's lies and let the dead stay buried. Part of her wanted to find them, wanted to sit across a table and look at another person who understood what it felt like to be the only one left. to carry names that nobody else remembered. But another part of her understood why they'd stayed anonymous. Because once you became visible, you became vulnerable. And some people needed to stay hidden to survive. If they want to be found, they'll reach out, she said. Until then, I'll do what I'm doing. Make sure the people who died aren't erased. Beckett nodded. The Navy offered me a position, special advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations on ethical oversight of classified programs. I accepted. You're going back. Someone has to make sure the reforms actually happen, that they're not just words on paper that get filed away and forgotten. And what are you going to do? He asked. Mara had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, since the hearing, since the arrests, since the moment she'd walked out of that Senate chamber and realized that she was no longer the fired nurse who nobody listened to. She was Mara Sinclair, the woman who'd exposed the largest defense contractor conspiracy in U.S. history, who'd saved an admiral's life, who'd testified before Congress and made 7 senators confront the fact that their oversight had failed so catastrophically that 680 people were dead. Walter Reed offered me a position, she said. Clinical director for a new program, medical advocacy for service members and veterans who've been exposed to experimental compounds. The program is funded through the Kestrel Act. I'd be working directly with Okafor's team to identify survivors from the other operations and connect them with medical monitoring and legal support. Are you going to take it? I already did. Beckett smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him smile. A real one, not the careful diplomatic expression he wore during testimony or briefings. It changed his face, made him look younger, less like an admiral, and more like a person who'd been through something terrible and had decided to build something better on the other side. You're going to be good at it, he said. I know. They stood together in the cemetery, 2 survivors of a system that had tried to erase them, and they didn't say anything else because there was nothing left to say. The work was ahead of them, months and years of it, identifying victims, building cases, holding people accountable, making sure that the reforms weren't hollow and the compensation wasn't symbolic and the dead weren't forgotten the moment the news cycle moved on. But right now, in this moment, they'd done something that had felt impossible 4 weeks ago. They'd taken the truth that had been buried and classified and redacted, and they'd put it on the record. They'd made it real. Mara looked at the 12 headstones one more time, at the names carved in marble, official and permanent, and finally acknowledged. I kept my promise, she said quietly. To Danny, to Keiko and Marcus and Jennifer and Aaron and Terrence and Michaela and David and Yasmin and Robert and Alan. You didn't die for nothing, and nobody is going to forget you. The rain started then, light at first, then heavier, the kind of October rain that turns leaves to pulp and makes the ground smell like earth and change. Beckett opened an umbrella and held it over both of them, and they walked back toward the parking lot where a federal SUV was waiting to take them back to Walter Reed. Mara's phone buzzed, a text from Okafor. Hargrove's legal team is trying to negotiate a plea. DOJ rejected it. Full trial, all charges. Thought you'd want to know. She typed back one word. Good. Then she put the phone away and looked out the window at the cemetery disappearing behind them. At the rows of white headstones, thousands of them, marking the lives of people who'd served and died and been remembered by a country that built monuments and passed legislation and promised to do better. She'd spent 4 years invisible, ignored by a hospital that treated her like furniture, dismissed by doctors who told her to stay in her lane, fired for doing the right thing, told that she was damaged, paranoid, too broken to function in a normal environment. And then she'd stood in a trauma bay with a borrowed gun and saved a man's life. And she'd stood in a Senate hearing room with a list of names and refused to let them be erased. And now she was heading back to a hospital where she had a title and a program and a mission that was bigger than anything she'd imagined when she was eating lunch alone in maintenance corridors and wondering if anyone would notice if she stopped showing up. She was visible now, not because someone had decided to see her, but because she'd made herself impossible to ignore. The SUV pulled onto the highway. The rain drummed against the roof. And Mara Sinclair, former combat medic, former invisible nurse, current director of a program that would change how the military treated its own people. Mara Sinclair closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not peace, not closure, but something close to both, purpose. She had names to find, survivors to help. A system to fix, piece by broken piece. And she wasn't done. Not even close. She was just getting started.